Good afternoon. It's not morning anymore. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second of our 3 informational hearings. Today is going to be, was supposed to be mostly for energy generators and organizations of generators, but because the hearing last week took so long, we had our friends from the utilities sitting around all day waiting to be heard. So we're going to start with them today. I just want to announce at the beginning, we are going to stick to a timeline today, try to be careful about what we do. So I'm going to give my co-chair a chance to say a few words.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This should be a very entertaining afternoon, I expect. I think we kind of wetted everyone's whistle with our first informational forum, which put a lot of issues on the table. And we fully expect that with generation being front and center these days, that today we will be able to explore a lot of the opportunities we have here in Connecticut and regionally to address our supply issues. And I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Fazio, ranking member.
Yes, certainly after the conversation we had the other week at our first informational session, I think this will be very useful for us as members and for the public to understand how we need to be tackling the problems of the reliability of our grid and making costs more affordable for consumers. So looking forward to it.
Thank you, Senator. And Representative Buckby.
Thank you and good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I'm already getting to move along. Okay, let's hear what's going on. Let's roll. Thank you.
I was waiting for the joke. Come on.
We generated enough jokes at the Yukon Law piece, so thank you.
I knew there would be one in there somewhere. Thank you for that. It's good to start with a sobering conversation with a lighthearted remark. So up first today for about a half hour between presentation and Q&A is Eversource, followed by United Illuminating. I'm not sure who's going to be the lead speaker on this from Eversource. Don't all fight at once. And this is really a discussion on roles and responsibilities and what you do, what you don't do, and a look at what the grid of today is and what the grid of tomorrow should be. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Needleman, Chairman Steinberg, Ranking Member Fazio, and Ranking Member Buckby, and also to the members of the committee. My name is Vincent Pace. I'm an Assistant General Counsel for Eversource, based here in Connecticut, and thank you for giving us the chance to appear in front of you today. I'd like to introduce our witness panel. To my side is Douglas Horton, who is our Vice President of Rates, James Daly, our Vice President of Energy Supply, and Jim Shukaro, who's our Director of Energy Supply. And for background purposes, we're going to provide just very brief background regarding Eversource, just very briefly, a slide or two. Next, we'll talk about how energy is procured here in Connecticut. And third, we'll talk about what's the cause of rising energy prices here in New England. It's resulting from a fuel shortage. And the most important part of our presentation is talk about potential solutions. We're going to talk about 2 solutions. The first is a near-term solution through a regional energy bridge portfolio, and then the longer-term solution, which is offshore wind, renewables, energy storage, and also transmission upgrades. So our next speaker will be Mr. Horton.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you to the committee. As Vincent mentioned, just very briefly, some background as context before I hand it over to my colleagues to jump into the topic of the day and some solutions and ideas that we have, and look forward to working with the committee and others as this all advances. Again, as background, we at Eversource employ about 4,000 colleagues here in Connecticut who are dedicated to providing electric, gas, and water service to our customers. We serve approximately 1.3 million electric customers in 149 cities and towns in Connecticut, 250,000 gas customers in 74 towns, and we provide water service to around 220,000 customers in 52 towns throughout Connecticut. As it relates to our electric service, which of course is the topic for today, we're proud of our track record of providing safe and reliable service. We have reliability ratings that put us in the top 15% nationally relative to our peers in terms of our reliability performance. And we also are proud to have one of the highest credit ratings amongst electric utilities in the country, which allows us to access capital at affordable rates, which helps keep costs down for our customers, which is particularly important in light of the magnitude of investment, which in 2022 approached $1.5 billion here in Connecticut. This investment ensures that we can provide the critical services our customers expect, and it's there when they need it. And it also helps to create jobs and support local taxes, which approaches $500 million a year in Connecticut. As I said, we're pleased to participate in this discussion and look forward to discussing solutions with all of you to solve some of the challenges that we're facing here in the region. And if we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to quickly put into context the magnitude of the issue as far as our customers see it. In Senator Fazio's opening remarks last week, I think he described it very well, that customers care about the output, which is the total bill. And certainly that is a very high total bill based on the current market prices for energy, but wanted to provide the context of what goes into the bill because it's sort of a complicated onion that we need to peel apart to make sure that we're delivering real solutions that can help our customers. So on this slide, you can see the 4 components of the bill, which are the cost of the electricity that we procure on behalf of our customers. That's really going to be the focus of our comments today. And as I hand it over to my colleagues to talk about that, on January 1st, the supply prices that we procure based on market prices increased significantly, such that today that portion of the bill is about 70% of the cost that customers pay for the total output. The yellow block on the slide represents the cost of the regional electric grid or our transmission system, which is about 10% of the total bill. That portion of the bill is regulated by the federal government or FERC. The orange block represents public policy charges that are reflected on our bills. Fortunately for our customers today, that is a credit that is helping to offset to some extent the energy supply increase that we on January 1st. Historically, that represents about 10 to 15% of the bill. But today, as I said, is a credit as a result of an agreement reached in December to accelerate credits that would otherwise have flown back at a later time and over a longer period. So customers are seeing that benefit now. And then finally, the blue bar on this chart represents the costs of the electric distribution system. So that's the costs that we talk about when we talk about distribution rate cases or rate agreements. That's the portion of the bill, which today is about 24% of the total. And so we just wanted to provide that as context as I hand it over to Jim to get into some of the forces driving the green bar.
Hey, thanks, Doug. Good afternoon, everybody. Next few slides, we're going to be focused on basically the procurement process that we use at Eversource, really under the direction of the procurement manager. But just to refresh everybody's memory, back in 1998, we essentially restructured. What that meant is we sold the generation units that basically Eversource had owned at that point in time. At the same point in time, and very importantly, a retail competitive market began. That really implied that customers could choose who their electric supplier would be. Could either be a retail competitive supplier, or it could be, if they did not, they would rely upon Eversource. So beginning in 2000, basically customers had choice. Residential customers, commercial and industrial customers, and whatnot. The process is called standard offer service. And what's interesting at this point in time, and now we've been into it over 20 years, at least as of the end of last year, about 90% of the residential customers that for Eversource still got their power supply from Eversource. The remaining 10% was from the retail competitive market. It's just the opposite, though, for the large customers. For the large customers, 90% get their power from the retail competitive market, and the rest basically rely upon Eversource. And for the commercial customers, it's kind of mixed. It's around the 35% range. So next slide, basically what we're going to be talking about today is the left-hand side, the generation component. That's overseen by FERC, as you heard from Mr. Van Wheely last week, with regards to the ISO New England oversees the wholesale competitive markets. We'll be touching on maybe a little bit with regards to transmission, which is regulated by FERC. And as Mr. Horton said earlier, the distribution portion is regulated by PERA. Okay, a key date and time was actually 2012, when the Connecticut legislature basically put in the process how we would procure standard offer going forward from 2012 on. And it's worked out pretty well. It boils down to that there was a procurement manager appointed. He develops a procurement plan. All have a voice into that plan, the EDCs, as well as the retail competitive market. That was developed and put in place in the 2012-13 time period. And as you can see on slide 7, basically what we're relying upon is that procurement plan going forward. And I'll get into the details in a moment. Okay, where we are today is with regards to the procurement process. And again, this is for the customers that haven't chosen a retail competitive supplier. That essentially we rely upon this procurement plan, and we go to market. Way we go to market is we don't serve the load ourselves for the most part. We basically rely upon what we describe as wholesale suppliers. And there were quite a few of those. At this point in time, there's not as many. So essentially what we do is we go out for bids. We actually do it in tranches. Tranches is just a percentage of the load. And the objective is because we serve a lot of load, it's around 10 million megawatt hours on an annual basis. We basically go out multiple times throughout the course of the year. Probably about 8 months in advance. We stagger it. We usually do 3 or 4 different purchasing periods. And so in each pricing period, for example, the one we're in now, which is called January through June pricing period, the other is July through December. We've actually went out and purchased 4 times for this current period. So the way the process works is under procurement plan, we put out an RFP. Folks bid. Bids come in at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we essentially review the bids with PERA and the Office of Consumer Counsel. Around 11 a.m., roughly an hour later, we compare bid prices to assure that we've all selected the right bids. Those would be the bids that are the most economic. After that discussion with the OCC and with PERA, essentially we select the best bids on the direction of the procurement manager. At that point in time, within Eversource, we share it with senior management, get their concurrence, and then we essentially enter into contracts with the winning parties around 2 in the afternoon. So roughly 4 hours after the bids come in. We're responsible for administering the contracts, and basically, as the slide indicates, we simply pass on the costs that we get from the market. So that's a quick overview. Actually, it was touched on by several speakers last week, but kind of sets the stage with regards to what we consider the key discussion now, which Mr. Daly is going to take up with regards to both short-term and longer-term remedies.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for agreeing to hear from us and our ideas on the wholesale market. So we're calling this a market dysfunction. Clearly, there's problems in the marketplace with the high prices that we're seeing for our customers. Something's wrong, and reliability is in jeopardy. Precarious, we've heard it called by ISO New England, whose job it is to ensure that these markets are reliable. So they've referred to it at other times as systemic problem in the marketplace, and I can go into that. So again, as a reminder, we're focusing on the left-hand side of the graphic that was up there. It's the generation side of the market. So looking at this chart, so the market is heavily reliant on natural gas for power generation. We all know that, so this is just foundational. And natural gas is a fuel to power plants. So power plants themselves are responsible for the fuel that's needed to run. ISO New England is not, and they'll tell you that. It's the power plants have the responsibility to have the fuel that they need to run. Natural gas prices here in New England, you'll see it on the chart on the right-hand side. Natural gas generates about 45% of the electricity here in New England. And it establishes the clearing price for most of the time. So it's the one that drives the price of electricity largest. So the interesting thing about on the right-hand side, although we have that large amount of gas-fired generation in the region, which largely came about with combined cycle generation technology as the most efficient technology, we didn't plan for additional pipeline capacity to provide that generation. Very, very little of actual pipeline capacity came with that very large level of power generation. So we find ourselves with a large demand for natural gas. And when people say there's too much natural gas dependency, well, there is for the amount of transportation we have. So we haven't provided the fuel delivery systems that would be needed to power all that. That's a major deficiency. One area that we're using to top up the supply of natural gas. So if you don't have pipelines that connect the production areas, and we've very prolific production areas in the United States, very near here, a few hundred miles to our west, in the Marcellus Shale area. So we have abundant supplies of natural gas here in the United States, just not here in the Northeast, because we haven't provided for them. And this is the primary cause of the very high prices we're experiencing now. Another additional, more recent development is, when this region then hasn't got pipeline natural gas, it tops up its supply on cold winter days with liquefied natural gas. And that's basically imported via tankers to places like the Everett Marine Terminal, the Repsol, the Canaport facility in New Brunswick. And occasionally there's an offshore buoy that delivers cargoes. The price of that LNG has become very, very expensive. We run 3 gas LDC companies, so we firsthand experience of paying for natural gas, which is the top-up fuel in that market on very cold winter days as well. We used to be able to buy LNG in this market at about $8–10 per decatherm. This past winter, it has been at $45 per decatherm if you buy it months forward. And it's been $60 and $100 a decatherm if you only buy it in the spot market. So LNG has been a major driver, predominantly due to the European situation with the war in the Ukraine. There's been a huge demand for LNG in Europe, which has driven the international price of LNG very, very high. And as we use it for our top-up fuel on winter days, that's what's setting the price. And our power generators, our suppliers, price that into the market. So when they're bidding for the service that my colleague, Mr. Shukuru, is looking for to supply our customers, in the wintertime, our suppliers are pricing in that very, very high fuel. So one would think that if you have a very high and driven price for fuel, the laws of economics would say if you provide more of it, prices should decline. Also, reliability should increase because price and reliability are pretty closely related. So I put this up. This is a little bit technical, but it gives you a visual of some of the dynamics in the marketplace. So the 1H in our parlance, forgive us, is the first half of 2023. So to read this chart, and the idea here is to give you an idea of the volatility and high prices in the marketplace. So if you look on the left-hand side of this chart, back in, we'll say, January of 2021, you could have bought power for the first half of 2023. So all of 2023 first half, you could have bought power at about $45 per megawatt hour, 4.5 cents. Now, you remember back in January of 2021, we were in pandemic mode. So demand had decreased a lot. So prices were relatively low. As the economy started to recover, demand started to increase as people returned to work, et cetera. And you can see the climb up. And again, now this is all buying for delivery in the first half of 2023, where we sit today. So you can see the prices start to climb and climb and climb. And then you'll see in, you know, in July of 2022, in the summer of 2022, is we're buying our power for customers in the last half of last year, and some for the next, for this part of this year, because as Jim explained, we buy it in tranches or percentages, if you like, at a time. You can see the volatility, and, you know, depending on what day you're in the marketplace, and our timing is heavily driven by, is dictated to us by our regulators, essentially, that you go to the market to have these supplies secured at certain times and dates, and contract forward. So you can see, you know, on, if you were, it's a big function of timing as to when you're in the marketplace. So you could see on certain days, you could have bought for $190 a megawatt hour. And in other days, you could have bought, maybe a week or so later, you could have bought it at 140. None of these numbers are low, but there's a huge difference there, $50 a megawatt hour. So there's a good sport that people have as saying, well, UI went out and got really cheap power, and Eversource went out and got expensive power. And clearly UI knows what they're doing and Eversource doesn't. You know, so that makes a headline for a day. But this is the cause of it. It's the timing in the marketplace, and it flips the other way. So I could make the same statement interposing UI and Eversource. So this is the market we're dealt with, and this is the consequences of a very tight market situation. A lot of volatility. The good news is you can see it's coming down a little bit, but it's not coming down an awful lot because we still have a very constrained marketplace here in the Northeast. So that just explains to you a little bit about the dynamics of when you see different prices and the very high prices that you're seeing in the marketplace. So two messages maybe there. So Vincent. So this is another view of, so we were asked on January 3rd to explain how we do this same job as we do in Connecticut for standard service, how we do it across the other territories that we buy power for. And this is a chart. You'll see the legend on the bottom. I'll give you a minute to look at it. So the legend on the bottom is, this is our Massachusetts. We have East and West territories, Connecticut, and then New Hampshire. And this is going back to 2004. So quite a period of time. We've been operating under the same rules, very similar rules in Massachusetts and New Hampshire as we are here in Connecticut. We go to market regularly by tranches or percentages of our needs forward in the marketplace. And we blend in these prices then to get these retail prices. These are our retail. You'll notice that the message here I wanted to convey was that the bottom, the colors on New Hampshire and Connecticut are at the low end of the market. So for Connecticut and New Hampshire, we're buying pretty much at the lower end. And that's driven largely by the Renewable Portfolio Standards requirements, the RPS we call it. So this is the renewable component of the bill that we have to blend in to get the retail, to get the total retail component. So you'll notice that in New Hampshire and Connecticut are less heavily weighted with the renewable piece than Massachusetts is, for example. So that accounts for the difference in those levels. But you'll see it has the same pattern of up and down. And that's largely the summer and winter effect. The winter is more expensive, and the summer is less so because of the winter constrained gas situation. So that accounts for the sawtooth, and that accounts for the differences. But largely looking at this, we would say they're very similar. They're very similar in levels, other than what's driven by state policies. So this is a look into the future. So we're saying, well, what is it today and what is it in the future? And today is the left-hand pie chart. And that's the one you've seen earlier. So you can see heavily dependent on natural gas. We have our nuclear imports and renewables. And then what we're doing is using the ISO interconnection queue. This is the queue of new resources that are looking to come online. So they're the pie chart on the right-hand side. And we're using that as a proxy for what the fuel mix is going to be in the future. So you'll see heavily offshore wind, some battery storage, transmission upgrades are transmission lines that are needed to both import power and to distribute the power around the region, for example, from offshore wind. It needs to get to the load centers. So there's transmission projects in the queue. There are wind, solar, battery, etc. So that's the future that we're looking to. And we say, how do we get to the future? So the way we get to the future is by we need a bridge fuel. We need a fuel that gets us there. If we don't, we can continue to pay the high prices that you've seen. So this is the problem that needs to be solved for the region. And this is the one that I would urge you to focus your attention on, is how do we get more fuel in the region, not forever, because people don't like the idea of fossil fuels being around for forever. We are replacing them, obviously, putting a lot of money and resources into the right-hand side of this. So therefore, when do we get the benefit? Well, we get them when they come online. And they are some years off. I won't put a number on it, but they are some years off. And how many years do you want to be revisiting this every winter? Do you want us here every winter? And do we want to be talking to you every winter like this? Basically about a bad story of high prices and poor reliability. We do not. We especially do not. And I'm sure you don't either. So the question is, what do you do about it? Vincent, if I got the next slide, please. So here are some solutions. We need to transition to an energy future with lower energy prices, but also with renewable energy. So Eversource supports the transition to cleaner energy future that includes acceleration of offshore wind, renewables, energy storage, all of that good stuff that's in the planning. So we can say there's quite an agreement on the future, just how to get there. It takes several years, as I say, but we have to fix the structural deficiency that we have in the marketplace. And it'll persist during this transition unless we procure more fuel for the region as a temporary measure. I'd say that the good news in this, if you can find it, is that we don't really have to build a whole load of new stuff. There's stuff built that we can use. So there's LNG import facilities. There are tanks beside power plants that generally only go half full in a winter time, that we can bring more fuel into those, utilize the existing resources as we're waiting for these new resources to come along, and then let those older resources exit the marketplace. So that's a plan, right? It's a way to get there. You don't have to invent cold fusion, as I say, to get this. Nothing really that fancy. It's just there's got to be a will and a way to do it and pay for it. And the pay for it will reap dividends. It will lower those prices, and it will increase reliability. So these are the things we need to do. And I would say it's not that there's nothing happening on this. There are a number of efforts underway in this with ISO, the stakeholders, but it's been extremely difficult to get agreement on it. We need some leadership on this that's been lacking. Everybody is saying, well, we can't do it. Somebody else says we can't do it. And I'll remind you that the beneficiaries of the high prices is power generation. They're selling energy at high prices, which that's their responsibility. That's their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders and to their owners, is to maximize their profits. So it's not really in their interest. And this is a key point. It's not really in their interest to flood the market with fuel. It would lower their revenues. I wouldn't want to be taking those ideas to their board of directors and saying, I got a great idea how to lower prices in New England. We'll order up 10 shiploads of LNG and that'll do it. That's not really in their own interests, but it could be in the state's interests to order up more fuel and find a way to get that into the marketplace and pay for it. So this is what we're calling, could we flip forward? So there needs to be a collaboration between the New England states to establish an energy bridge portfolio. It's also called energy reserve, it's been called, but it's the reserve piece that's needed when the market gets very constrained and we get really prolonged cold weather like we had last weekend, but it lasts 10, 15 days and exhausts the fuel supply we need because the market is pricing in that potential shortage. And that's why we're getting these very high prices. So the states really need to come together. I mean, there are other things that we're doing here in terms of energy efficiency needs to be part of this. So you can order up more oil and LNG, more fuels, but we also will tap into energy efficiency, demand response. We'll also tap into those ahead of those resources. So we're going to need to maximize that. There's also advanced metering infrastructure that needs to be part. This is over several years now. So advanced metering infrastructure gives customers control over their load, which is which is obviously load reduction is a form of response to the marketplace. And we can set up tariffs and structures that customers can benefit from actually doing that. So the future needs to include these resources. But we're calling it energy reserve portfolio. We don't mind what you call it. Just call it an energy bridge portfolio, call it energy reserves. But that's the way to reduce volatility and prices for us, for our consumers going forward. So in conclusion, a fairly simple graphic says that you have 25 cents per kilowatt hour, which is what we've been paying for power. We want to get it back down to the 8 to 12 cents area at least. And the way to do it is to bring more fuel into the market through an energy bridge portfolio. Can be designed to cover the gap between now and when more renewables are needed. And as I said, it's to cover a gap. It's not to be here forever. And you don't need to build new resources for this. You need to utilize the existing ones. So I hope you found that interesting at least, and hopefully a path forward that can get us out of this. Let's meet on the high prices and figure out what's gone wrong. I think we know what's gone wrong. Now we need to do something about it. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
At the last slide,
That's the last slide.
another bleak picture, Jim.
Isn't
Thank
it
you.
enough? Isn't it enough?
Yeah, it's really enough. And I know that my colleagues are going to have a bunch of questions. You guys sell natural gas, don't you?
Yes, we do.
You guys lobby to actually expand the natural gas infrastructure in the state? Are you still building out infrastructure in the state?
We're building out distribution infrastructure in response to customers' demands. That's it. And occasionally we have to add upstream capacity on interstate pipelines to meet that demand.
We know that that's not going to happen. Obviously, there's no impetus to build out pipelines that are going to have a 50-year lifespan now as we're moving away as a bridge fuel. So particularly intrigued about the storage component. Large scale natural gas storage doesn't seem to be likely to get you through the 10-day period. And the volatility that we're looking at this year seems to be more driven by the war and the high price of LNG, which had been available when we needed it. So we were looking last year at a winter rate of about 12 cents, right?
Yep.
So we have a circumstance here that we want to react to, obviously. And obviously there are different ways to react to it. You know, you talked about the time frame of procurements. One way to possibly level this out is to procure over a longer period of time. Although I can't speak to what that schedule would look like, but I know in the vertical market in Vermont, they didn't see the spike that we saw because their procurement schedule is longer. But our procurement schedule worked up until now, you know, the back and forth with UI and which is a little more and which is a little less, notwithstanding. So I have a lot of questions, but part of me thinks that we shouldn't be building it. And we've had this
Yeah,
conversation
I just want to be
before.
clear, we're not advocating to build more LNG. As I said
Right.
a couple of times, we're looking to utilize existing facilities that we can, this is for power generation now. So there are different markets going on here. And for power generation, we don't see there's any need to build new resources. We can utilize the existing resources. What's missing is the forward contracting piece. So going into the winter, we're reliant on spot market prices for our fuels. So we don't have a reserve established as we're going into the winter. And the room for that is already built. So I'm not advocating that we build large scale storage to solve this problem.
We know we're losing one of those resources. It's on the boards to be lost. The Mystic Power Station is going to shut down in all likelihood, and that terminal, which is critical to the infrastructure. So are you suggesting that the states band together and buy it?
I don't think they need to buy it. I think the owners of that facility, I would speculate, would be happy to continue to own and operate it if they get the right commercial arrangements to do it. So I don't think the states need to own that facility, but I do think, consistent with what we've heard from ISO New England, is that facility is critical to the reliability in the New England, and that we would be in a worse situation. So you can ask yourself, are you going to be in a worse situation when we meet around this table again next winter? Are we going to be in worse or better with facilities like the Everett Marine Terminal gone? And I'd say it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out we're going to be worse, right? So
I loved your comment. If there's any good news in it, here it is. So some, and Gordon suggested this last time, and I just want to say one thing, Vincent, this is not, no one's testifying. We're just asking, this is a conversation here. It's an educational forum more than anything else. So I want to keep that in mind. And I'm going to recognize my co-chair, who I know has a lot of questions, and then we'll go around the room.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's continue on the conversation with the procurement process. Obviously, this didn't work for us last time out. We buy the power in advance as we need to do to assure supply when we need it. But one could easily argue that this increase in price was predictable. We knew about that as soon as the war started. And yet, obviously, the constraints we put on the procurement process, the timing and the size of the tranches limited your ability. Wouldn't it be a simple solution, as my co-chair mentioned, to loosen the reins a little bit on the timing of that? You say you have Pure and OCC at the table with you on the day of procurement. It would certainly be in the ratepayers' interest for us not to buy on a bad day for procurement. Knowing that it was trending up, could we not put in a different process which would allow us to acquire more energy when the price is down, knowing it's about to go up? Is that something you've looked at?
Yeah, we actually do that with the procurement manager when I talked about the tranches, and it's not hardwired that you buy X amount at X point in time. We have purchased more when the price looks better, and we have purchased less when the price doesn't do as well. So there's some flexibility in the plan. I think two things I want to point out. Number one is the Connecticut plan worked really terrifically until we got till January of 2023. The laddering led to prices, if you look back at the chart, which was slide 11, we're actually one of the lowest prices in New England. Customers came back. A lot of customers came back to the standard offer service of Eversource, commercial and residential customers, because they were price sensitive. So sure, given this uncertainty, I think we agreed to on the January 3rd presentation that we're very happy to sit down with the procurement manager and UI and others and talk about different ways to procure the power. And obviously maybe stretching it out over longer time periods may make sense. Keep in mind that that's a two-way street. It helps you in a rising market, but also hurts you in a falling market. If we look at market conditions today, with regard to this coming summer, we don't have the winter issues. We are still in the July through December time period. Is market conditions are pointing to prices around 14 cents a kilowatt hour, which is around 10 cents below what the current standard offer price is. What's going to be for next winter? I think there's a lot of TBDs. We are struggling with the number of bidders we have. I think I mentioned in my comments before, we had many. We're down to a couple of major players, and they're not making a lot of bids. And the price premiums are very large compared to what they used to be. It's due to all the things Mr. Daly described, is the fact that there's this fuel uncertainty, this natural gas uncertainty. And as such, if you had an extended cold weather, we got a flavor of it this past weekend, that lasts for a long time. We don't know where prices are going to be. On Saturday, for example, I was monitoring the ISO prices, both day ahead in real time, and they were in the 22, 23, 24 cents a kilowatt hour range, which I think was expected right at the first days, but it had gone up dramatically. So there's much to talk about. I think there's things that we can do to refine the procurement plan and be sensitive to where we are over the next few years. As Mr. Daly expressed, we have to come up with remedies for the next 4 or 5 years at a minimum, because not until then will we get large scale resources that will help to dampen the price such that it won't be dependent upon natural gas.
I agree with you, and I think that there is a potential for a Groundhog Day scenario over the next several years, and you think we'd want to get out in front of this and change the behavior before we have to repeat it, knowing better. That's what I think that we're going to focus on. Also talking about the LNG, the peaker supply, it's a hedge, obviously, that we don't know how we're going to utilize in any given day. To your point, not only did we use LNG over the weekend, we used oil to an extreme degree as well. Even though we want to avoid it, guaranteeing supply is our number one priority in terms of the reliability of the system. In terms of risk management, how much LNG should we be acquiring, knowing that in any given winter, the number of peak periods will vary?
So that's a question that everybody has for ISO New England. Like, what is, how much should we purchase? About middle of summer last year, ISO published their view of what the deficiency was, and it's about 20 BCF, which is about seven cargo ships of deliveries. And maybe in an average winter, we get about 20. We get in the range of 20 to 30 something. So it's a fair level of deficiency for those peak days. It's very significant.
It sounds like we need a plan for that, which is not just Connecticut. It's a regional
Absolutely.
consideration.
And
Lastly, just quickly, you mentioned demand response. Let's assume that Eversource picks up the pace and gets AMI instituted in 2 to 3 years. Does that mean the day that you're done putting in the smart meters that we can count on demand response? There'll be a mechanism in place where consumers will have more choice. What's it going to take to get there?
I can try on that one. I think the simple answer is likely no. There's a lot of customer education and engagement that really is going to need to come with that. And I think the presentation we heard last week, I would agree with the sentiment that it's an enabler. But really to make it seamless for customers and have demand response working to its full potential, there's going to need to be other technological solutions as well as customer engagement and involvement. There's going to need to be a thought to rate design and new rate structures to incentivize the behavior that we're looking for. So it isn't the end all be all from that perspective, at least in my mind, but it certainly is a tool that we hope we'll be able to offer to our customers that will help.
Thank you. We look forward to you being quick to get them out there, but also to share with us your plan for how you would actually implement demand response. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Cheeseman, followed by Senator Fazio.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But to both chairs, thank you for coming here today. Just 2 quick questions. One, there was talk last week as we discuss rates, and we're obviously looking at energy prices today, but there was mention of settlements, and maybe there wasn't real value to the ratepayers and the state in those settlements. Do you have a differing view, and can you weigh in on that? Because we need to look at everything when we're looking at what our customers or our residents are paying.
Absolutely. And again, I can start. So if we think back to that slide 4, as you pointed out, today we're talking about the cost of energy. That is a pass through to us. We make no money on that. When we talk about settlements, generally we're talking about the distribution portion of the bill, which is the bottom blue bar. And so if we remember that we're a regulated monopoly, we are not afraid of regulation. Nearly everything we do is regulated, and that's just the world in which we live. We're talking about settling outcomes before PURA that really do produce real value to customers in a settlement agreement. Well, first, in a distribution rate case, as a regulated monopoly, we are, per the Constitution, allowed to recover our cost of service. And so that means that the genesis of a rate case or rate proceeding is trying to identify what is the cost of service that our customers should be paying. A settlement agreement is a tool that allows parties to that proceeding to come up with solutions that are to the benefit of customers. There's a perception that settlement agreements are a shortcut to the process. In my experience, that's not the case. The settlement agreements that I've been a party to in Connecticut have been as a result or after the litigation process has already gone through, and it allows the parties to come up with creative solutions that wouldn't otherwise be available to the regulator, in the interest of coming up with, again, creative solutions. The 2021 settlement agreement did a number of things. It allowed for a significant credit to be passed on to customers that in the absence of that settlement agreement just would not have happened. And so I think there's a lot of value and benefit to settlement agreements, and they should be allowed to stay on the table so that the parties to the case can make concessions and work together to come up with solutions that benefit customers.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure there are differing views on those, but I appreciate you explaining your position. So getting back to the idea that the state should engage in procuring these backup supplies, LNG, whatever, are you suggesting that it's a consortium of the states that the idea of Connecticut going out and putting out contracts for large quantities of LNG makes me slightly nervous. So I'd like you to expound on that if you
Yeah,
could,
that's excellent question. I mean, there are different ways to approach this. It's clear that we do need a more secure supply of fuel into the region, and there does need to be a sharing of that among the states. So I think we need an engagement among the states as to how to do this, and it could be a different tariff mechanism to share the costs. It could be we do it in conjunction with the power generators, that we put in place an incentive for them to go and get that fuel and manage it, and that we share the cost of that. So, I think we need to get together as an industry with a view to solving this problem, because it's not going to benefit any of us if it continues with these high prices and reliability gets worse. If we get a really cold winter, which can happen any winter, we need to be prepared. We can't go into a winter saying, well, I hope it's going to be mild. We can't do that. But as an industry, we have to be able to say, we have assured supply for this winter, even if we get a polar vortex, even if we get a very severe winter, compared with what we've had in the past. And with electrification, we need to address it even more seriously. So we need to get to a point that when we're going into the winter, we're pretty assured that we're going to be able to get through it no matter what the weather throws at us. I don't think the states can do this on their own. I don't think they can do it over the objections of the existing stakeholders, which include the power generators and ourselves. I mean, we're here explaining this to you, although we don't own any power plants, we don't own any fuel for power generation, but we have an interest in protecting our customers from both these high prices, because we have to collect the bills, send them out and collect them. That's not an easy task in the current environment. And we're concerned with reliability. Reliability for us is job one. If we don't have that, we don't have service to our customers. So I think that, but there needs to be a catalyst here. There needs to be something that happens different than as what's happened in the past. ISO says, I can't do this. I'm not responsible for fuel supply. FERC didn't give it to me. FERC says we're not responsible either. We'll allow the prices to go up and the market will solve it. But that has not been working. So we need to try something new. And I think it's in our interest and the state's interest to get together and figure out how to solve this problem until the new policy that's been implemented by the states, which is the renewable energy, comes along. So I think it's a consequence of a lot of different things that are happening. But I think it's going to take a collective response that I think is urgent. We don't want to do this next winter again.
Oh, I agree. And your mention of reliability, I think, is key. And I welcome the conversation. I just wish everyone that we're going to hear from would engage in the kind of collaborative thinking that we want to embrace, as opposed to finger pointing, because I think entirely too much of that goes on.
Right.
We are not going to solve the solution by blaming everybody else for the problem. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. And I do believe those conversations are going on right now, collaboratively with the other states. And I hope that we do come to some solution. But I want to say that this is not a new problem. In 2015, almost immediately after I agreed and worked with Southern Connecticut Gas, not your gas company, their gas company, to build out the gas pipeline through Essex into Deep River. In my capacity as first selectman, I was followed up by the emergency management people in Eversource saying, we have a winter reliability problem. We've been living with it for 7 years. The war made it infinitely worse, obviously, and it sort of highlighted it. But we did have a forum on this a year and a half ago or a year and 4 months ago. We're living with this problem, and it is really, really dangerous. Winter reliability is catastrophic issue. So we are already 15 minutes over. I'm going to call on a few more people that have their hands up. Senator Fazio, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to be quick. If you smooth that purchase over a long period of time, you wouldn't probably reduce the average price that people pay, but you'd be reducing the volatility that people pay for it. So, you pay for reducing risk. So that is a value to people if you stretched out the purchasing program longer term, theoretically. But I'm thinking out loud, and we've seen this with generators here. If you stretched out the purchases, you also create a little more certainty for generators, and theoretically, that sort of certainty could create a more stability to the supply. I'm wondering if you've seen elsewhere, in the country or anywhere else, where the purchasing program is longer term, if you see that supply response from the generators, or there's other kind of data points there that point to success, or maybe no positive results to speak of from a longer term purchasing regime.
Yeah, with regards to other regions, we have looked at it, but we didn't feel the information was really providing value to the situation we have in New England for all the reasons we've been talking about. We have this unique situation in the winter months where our prices skyrocket. To give some specificity, we were seeing bids in the month of January. This is just for the power supply, 50 cents a kilowatt hour. February, also 40 cents a kilowatt hour. It's due to all the concerns that Mr. Daly was sharing with you. So, I think we need to talk through, like we committed to a little bit earlier in this presentation, with regards to the best way to do it, given the uniqueness of the situation. I can share with you that you're going to hear varying opinions with regards to it. Some people will advocate that the high prices we're experiencing is really a pricing signal, and they have concerns about smoothing out. There's pros and cons with all this. I'm just sharing with you that it's not going to be simple. There's going to be different thoughts. What we arrived at least in Connecticut, was really a compromise of all those various opinions. And as the charts have shown, it worked well. but finally, the market's caught up to us. You just can't buy so far in advance. Eventually, you're going to run out of the older, cheaper purchases, and you're going to basically tie in the newer, more expensive ones. And that's what happened in Connecticut. And we basically were the last to see the really big price increases. And that was represented, the procurement plan that was developed in the 12, 13, 14 time period was really this balance that came in. So just sharing some experiences and lessons learned, but obviously given the uniqueness of the situation and given the high prices, this needs a deep dive.
Yeah. And if you stretch your average, I don't know what your average watt, kilowatt hour is purchased in advance. So if you stretch it out from 6 months to 18 months, you're probably not going to reduce the aggregate prices in the near term. You're just going to reduce the volatility. But that goes to the bigger question of what you were saying before, that the real problem is long-term supply and demand, that we don't have enough supply to meet the demand of a grid that's going to see a 20 gigawatt increase in winter peak demand. And so, you mentioned that, the high prices and certainly generators don't have incentive to suppress prices, but in the idea of this reorganized deregulated system is that the saying in the commodities space is the solution to high prices is high prices, because it incentivizes more capital investment and more supply, which in the long run reduces prices. So, in a high price regime, you would expect more supply in the long run to come on. I guess thinking out loud again, the two barriers to that, one, are that you can't necessarily, you can forecast out those rates, but you can't secure those rates if you're not doing long-term purchases. And the exceptions, obviously, that are front of mind to us are the offshore wind and the Millstone contract, which were long-term. So that's the state actively raising its hand and saying, in order to secure supply, we're going to go out forward, 10 years in advance and promise you that. And hopefully the prices we're paying are, again, are levelized. So it's not a bad deal for ratepayers. But so the barriers to that, now thinking through the barriers to that, it's, it could be infrastructure, I guess. It could, maybe they don't have enough. We're not doing enough long-term purchasing. So why wouldn't the high prices be able to bring on more supply to solve that supply and demand imbalance?
Well, the issue is in infrastructure. It's very, very difficult. If you talk about supply, you need to either, one, utilize more the infrastructure you have, or then bring on new infrastructure. And of course, as a region, we're putting our investment in new infrastructure in offshore wind and renewables. So that's where we're putting our money. And in the shorter term, and to make an impact in the shorter term, the only real way, because you can't build new infrastructure overnight. It takes years, obviously. And this region's very difficult, very litigious, takes a long time. So is to better utilize the ones you have. And since you won't need them forever anyway, because of the new resources we're investing in, look at ways to utilize what we have is the quickest way to make an impact by increasing supply using those resources.
Yeah, and it almost creates this conflict, saying that we're going to get rid of these resources, but we need to keep these resources because it says to the investors who own those assets that the cash flow is going to stop at a certain point.
Yeah.
So it also creates this circular problem.
Well, that's exactly what's been happening. So we've seen the older. We've had big retirements of baseload units in the region, like Pilgrim, the Brayton Point units, et cetera. These were large baseload units that were exited the market because they didn't see a future for themselves on reinvesting, and that's why we're tight in the generation side of the market. Those were non-gas fired generation. So we've shifted onto more gas fired demand, while those other resources disappeared, and now we're in a short situation. It's not rocket science. We built ourselves into this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fazio and Representative Foster. I'm reminding everybody about the time. We're already 25 minutes over.
I'll just ask quickly and I can take this response afterwards. But as I was looking at some of the slides that you've shared, we see a lot of congruousness between us and other Northeastern states, which gives me a lot of reason to feel like we're sort of stuck. If that we have these other states in the ISO region, we can compare ourselves to. If we look at what we could do as legislators, we compare ourselves to the surrounding states with similar access to ISO, and there's not significant differences. That tells us we're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. But I did notice at the end, and we didn't touch on it, at the end of the slide that you compared the multi-state, I don't know if you can put this slide back on, that New Hampshire had a relatively precipitous drop that mirrored the sort of sawing pattern that we discussed. But it was out of sync with the rest of the drops. So what did New Hampshire do?
Yeah, New Hampshire, I think you're referring to first of all, the 2021-22 time period, Representative.
It's between 2020, it's 1H 2022 and 2H 2022. And I guess it's hard, it's kind of hard. There's not, you don't have.
Yeah, a couple of details here. First of all, we talked about the laddering or the tranches that we purchase in advance of need. New Hampshire does not. They're very market price at that time. So when I purchase New Hampshire, I'm purchasing 100% of what they need at that point in time. So, and they're also on a slightly different time period. They're on a time period of essentially August through January and February through July. The reason for that is they split the two highest price months. They help to address some of the volatility concerns we've been talking about. So the big change you saw where the line almost went straight up to purple for New Hampshire was really due to purchases that we made for 100% of what they needed for the essentially the August through July 23, August 23 through July 23 time period. So there is no laddering, there was no dampening of the price at all. The slight decrease that you saw was really due to the effect of the fact that that price is really a February. That price is going to happen a February through July time period. So they getting a little technical here, but they chopped out one of the high price months. And that's why they went from roughly 22 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Yeah. Yeah. And they don't do the laddering. So they didn't have the smoothing effect. That's why their price went up so much versus the other states where it went up more gradual for all the reasons we talked about. We had the lower price purchases blended with the higher price purchases. But eventually everybody got to the same market price. And that's really where we're at right now, is the prices are similar in all the states.
Okay, thanks.
You, Representative Foster. I think Representative Meskers has his hand up.
Thank you very much. I guess the presentation is clear at some level and leaves me confused at another level, which is the priorities between transmission, generation, and storage. So if I'm trying to understand the conflict here, when we talk about transmission, we're talking about incremental gas pipelines, which I don't think any of us are looking to build infrastructure for 30 or 40 years or 50 years of gas pipelines across the state. So the question on storage and transmission of energy and electrons are across states, as within ISO New England and within your own region. And it'd be interesting to know, and I assume on the storage side, we're talking about the battery storage for peak demand, et cetera, but also liquid natural gas storage. And so if you can address, how you would prioritize, you're responsible for distribution. So I would expect you to be anxious to see bigger, broader, better distribution to carry a load that could reduce pricing. But if you're looking at the generating part as being the source of the cost, it's kind of storage. And you're thinking liquid natural gas. And how long do you envision? And what's the normal lifespan of if we're trying to increase the storage, either by repurposing or using it? What are you saying there? I'm asking, I guess, a little more explicit declaration.
Well, in our view going forward, storage has a role. in terms of meeting peak demand and in terms of the energy needs of the region. There was a good conversation last week with ISO New England and Gordon Van Moyle. He talked about the energy density you need to meet load reliably. And this was energy storage typically would be 2 hours, 4 hours in duration. The type of supply we're talking about here is in the form of LNG. It's very dense and it can last a long time. So we're talking about 10 days of continuous supply, 14 days. Energy storage is not a tool for that. It's a tool for a different duty that could be 2 hours or 4 hours to optimize the system in terms of demand on the distribution or transmission system. So this is the role we're using for storage today. And
So you're saying, you're referring back, let's be clear, battery storage is a 2 to 6 hour issue, and you're saying LNG is a long-term energy storage is what you're suggesting.
exactly, yes.
Okay. And the lifespan of a storage tank, and when we look at that versus infrastructure, all of our residents who are concerned about our carbon footprint and global warming are worried about our being wed to carbon. So I guess presumably the liquid natural gas can be repurposed for hydrogen at some point in the future? Or what goes on with that kind of storage facility, or what kind of lifespan are we looking at?
Well, the storage facilities we have for LNG today, a lot of them were built in the 50s. They're not new. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So they have a finite life, maybe 50 years or something like that. But we are looking at any of these LNG facilities as to potentially repurpose them for hydrogen in the future. But that's more off in the distance in terms of concept. So, but is definitely in the playbook.
Right. I guess for not just for the optics, but the issue is if we're short long-term storage and liquid natural gas comes in, it doesn't guarantee us an eternal matrimony to carbon. I mean, when we're prepared, it presumably could be used if we get to green hydrogen, right? I know that's far off so far.
No, I agree with you. I mean, most of those facilities that we're referring to as existing have been built quite a long time ago. I mean, they're approaching the end of their useful life, although they can be repaired and maintained. So, but we're not married to them for a long time. That's why we're suggesting that we use the existing resources we have.
So, and then the other issue is we don't have enough electrons that we generate in the region. You're a transmission agent. Why can't we get, I know ISO would be more the agent, but why haven't we been able to source the electrons outside the state? And that's it for me for questions. I know we're running late.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we are doing some of that. We're under contract for the New England Clean Energy Connect, which is the new transmission line that's trying to get built through Maine in the face of a lot of opposition. But that's 1,090 megawatts of high capacity factor hydropower. So we are doing projects like that. And we also have transmission expansion for offshore wind generation that's in the planning phase right now and is starting to go into construction. So we're doing it, but New England is expensive and it takes a long time to get it done.
Okay, thank you. No further.
So gentlemen, thank you. We got into the weeds on some of the stuff. You're singing the same tune that ISO did, which is that we have a winter reliability problem. I believe that the war sort of exacerbated that and brought it to the surface. Not sure. Not making book on whether this is a new permanent situation. It seems as though the global markets have sort of moved stuff around, and we've all benefited from a warmer winter, Europe and us, thank God. And I suspect that if we don't find a solution and if we don't save the plant in Boston, the terminal in Boston, we're going to be in much worse shape. And we have to figure out a way to do that. I'm still not convinced that other types of storage of natural gas are not somewhere in there, because we're looking at 10 to 20 years, especially your graph shows a circle, but the circle in the future is going to be bigger. So gas, I think, is going to still play a big part of it, and I think we need to be prepared for that. I don't want to create unrealistic expectations, but it's still an anathema to me that we're building out in-state, in New England, natural gas infrastructure for home and business use while we know we have this problem. So I'm hoping that I believe Pure has gotten a handle on some of that, but I think that the best laid plans of mice and humans in 2014, when we thought we were going to get a second pipeline, led to this situation. And when that fell apart, we just continued down the path of making it worse. So hopefully we won't be there. And hopefully, Jim, you're going to be doing a spectacular job buying these next tranches, and we're going to see numbers that revert close to back to normal come July. I have faith in you because I know how long you've been doing it, and I appreciate all the hard work you do. And maybe Ryan, who's been, Senator Fazio, who's been in that market, maybe he can help you provide some insight in how to do that, because he has been an energy trader in the past. I don't even know how to search my electric bill back. Anyway, thank you guys so much. And we're going to bring up the folks from UI/Avangrid next, and we'll have more conversations. Thank you. Now we owe you two apologies, one for having you guys wait around last week, and now we're a half hour behind. I'd like to try to stay on schedule to the extent that we can, but we appreciate your coming. And, again, we can go deep into the weeds on some of this stuff, but we're just looking at explanations of what you do. And if you guys perceive solutions that are different than the Eversource folks, that would be great. But we know we have a winter reliability problem, and we also know we have high costs right now. So any suggestions are helpful.
Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, Chair Needleman and members of the Energy and Technology Committee. I'm Frank Reynolds. I'm the president of United Illuminating, and I'm joined by our general counsel, Kenna Hagan, and our director of wholesale power contracts, Christy Prescott. They're going to take us through the presentation here momentarily. I did have just a few comments that I wanted to make before we got into the presentation. And I think, you're absolutely right. We have an energy problem here in our state that's been echoed by Governor Lamont, his administration, that's been echoed by this committee, and that's certainly been echoed by our customers. I think we've seen roughly 150% increase in supply price costs over the past 3 years. We consider that unacceptable. And, we've been working with the administration to craft solutions, short-term solutions to help our customers in the immediate sense. So typically when customers open their energy bill every month, it's split between a T&D charge as well as a energy supply charge. The T&D portion or the distribution portion is our portion. That's what we use to maintain and invest in our transmission, our distribution lines, our substations, and our poles, certainly to maintain our infrastructure. The generation portion of the bill, the supply portion of the bill, is strictly a pass-through. There's no markup, there's no profit to the companies. It's strictly a pass-through to customers. The T&D portion typically makes up around 30% of the bill, and the supply portion makes up roughly 70% of the bill. I think it's worth noting that our T&D portion has remained flat for the last 6 years. And I think this committee probably knows that we're in front of Pure right now looking for a modest increase to our D&D rates to continue to invest in building the grid of the future. As we've been talking about solutions of the future, we need to continue to invest in the grid of the future, because I think many folks here know that when our distribution system was designed, it was designed for one-way power flow. So if we're going to really harness all the distributed energy resources out there, we need to redesign the system so that we've got two-way power flow out there. The process that we're going through right now is an incredibly transparent process. We've already responded to over 1,800 data requests from Pura and other interveners. And again, this is a very highly regulated and transparent process. I think if you contrast that to the supply price increases that we've seen here on the slides, there was zero transparency. And so we've continued to call for the generation companies to come and help our customers, just as the utilities have, in terms of some short-term relief. But we're also wanting to work with this committee and all involved in terms of getting longer-term solutions in terms of being able to maintain reliability, but also stability in the price market. And so I'm going to turn it over to Kenna Hagan and Christy Prescott. They're going to take us through the presentation, and we've got other folks here that will help to participate in terms of responding to questions that you might have. But I just want to say thank you again for allowing us to participate in this informational forum. We look forward to working with the committee to craft solutions that will help the hardworking families and our customers across the state.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair, members of the committee. My name is Kenna Hagan. As Frank mentioned, I'm General Counsel of the United Illuminating Company. I thought I would start us off with a joke, keeping in the spirit of the CPES forum. How do you tell the difference between a gas engineer and an electric engineer? The gas engineers are stinky. All joking aside, I've worked in the energy industry for almost 17 years. I love all engineers. They are the heart that makes us function. And so normally I wear a t-shirt that says I heart engineers, but I didn't bring it with me today. But all joking aside, I'll start with slide 2, if we can, Sarah. This is just a reminder of who we are. Avangrid serves 17 communities along the Long Island Sound. We're headquartered in Orange, Connecticut, where we've been proudly serving customers since 1899. You can go to the next slide. Frank has touched on some of the points already, so I'm going to touch on these lightly. But again, we welcome questions or comments as we go through the presentation. So this slide is just a simplistic approach of how energy is delivered, the energy delivery process to customers. And if you look at that first bucket, that's the supply component that Eversource talked a lot about. I agree with many of their points. They did a great job of explaining the components of that. And I'll emphasize again that the generators that provide most of that supply in Connecticut are out of state. Their rates are not regulated by Pura, and there is not transparency into how those rates are established or the profitability of those companies. Buckets 2 and 3 are transmission and distribution. That's the delivery portion of the bills. UI owns transmission and distribution assets in the state, both rates of which are fully transparent in different forums. Transmission, you can think of, are the high voltage assets akin to the interstate system in the state. And those rates are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. UI, along with most of the transmission owners in New England, have what are called formula rates, meaning we update those rates on an annual basis. They are filed and with FERC pursuant to a structure, an open structure, and you can find those filings on ISO New England's website as well as FERC. The second component, or the third bucket that we talked about, distribution, Frank mentioned, we're in the middle of a rate case here in the state of Connecticut. And similar to what Chair Gillette said last week, transparency is important. Again, we're a natural monopoly. Natural monopolies operate most efficiently when they're allowed to maximize their opportunity. That is with a balance of structured regulation. And I say structured regulation because there is a balance. Utilities we still are a business and still need to be able to operate and recover our costs as well as earn a return based on the risks that we invest. And the regulations are there to protect the customers. And so again, that transparent stakeholder process is important. At the end of the day, customers in their homes, businesses, and industries pay all components of the electricity delivery process. So if we can go to the next slide, just a quick breakdown of what that bill costs, those bill costs look like today. The energy supply cost, that first bucket, represents about 70% of the bill currently. Now, those components, and you'll see this may fluctuate, primarily driven by the price of energy on any given period. Frank mentioned that the supply costs are a pass-through. There is no markup, and we do not earn any extra revenue or incentive on the supply portion of the bill. The other portion, those second and third buckets, transmission and distribution, make up about 30% of the bill for delivery for today. Again, those are cost-based rates that are approved and reviewed by PURA. If you can go to the next slide. Stemming from my love of engineers, graphs are very important. I think visual representations to simplify complexities of what the energy industry is. So this graph represents an inflationary adjusted price components for the period 2004 to present. As you can see, the orange and the gray lines have remained fairly steady, and those represent the rates of transmission and distribution. Changes in that, are driven by investment, costs, driven by storm, things of that nature. You'll look at the blue line though and recognize, similar to the graph that Eversource showed, is the volatility seen in the supply price. In the most recent period, you can see that spike in the blue line that the supply price has increased more than 100% in the last year. A lot of discussion that you guys just held, Eversource covered. You asked some great questions. One of the big reasons that we're here today to talk about. But I guess I will emphasize one note that scarcity conditions plus market volatility are the components of the equation that bring profitability. In New England, because of the natural scarcity for fuel supply and infrastructure, those conditions are ripe. In other markets, there's fraud and manipulation that have occurred. We think of Enron back in 2000 that created those false conditions because profitability drives business. Here in New England, we have that. And as we talk about solutions that are needed to curb that volatility, I agree fuel supply is a piece of that, but I think just as important, diversity of supply is needed. We can flip to the next slide. One of the key focuses that UI has is being able to provide customer service, share information with customers. And I agree with Chair Gillette that she said last week, transparency is important. Customers need to understand what they are, what their energy bill is made of. In conjunction with PURA and guidance from them, UI and Eversource have a bill redesign that will be coming out. Ours is targeted to launch in September. But as you can see, just like the buckets of costs and the energy supply we discussed earlier, those are going to show up on customers' bill so that they understand what portion is the supply, what portion is transmission, what portion is distribution, and what portion is public policy. This helps them understand and be educated not only about how energy is delivered to them, but also to help them make decisions on their use, right? As prices go up, we are incented as consumers to change our behavior. And this is just a component to help customers be informed to think about what kind of behaviors they want to have around their energy, just like we do around driving and fueling our cars, as well as purchasing groceries at the grocery store. If we can go to the next slide, Sarah. Just to touch on a few components of other things that appear on the bill. Again, only about 30% of the bill component today goes back to UI to recover the cost to operate the system, as well as a return for the capital invested. There are many things that are collected through rates, including taxes. That's property taxes, sales taxes, different things that go back to our local municipalities, counties, and state. Next slide. As Frank mentioned, we are in the middle of a rate case, and that is the primary way that utilities go and ask for a change in rates, right? A way to recover the costs that it takes to run and provide this essential service for our modern lives. And it is now a 12-month process, and agree with the work that I think this committee has done and some legislation passed to extend that amount of time for review. Stakeholder input is really important in these complicated matters, and I think that 12-month time frame for a rate case review is now consistent with what we see across the rest of the country, which is about a 6 to 12-month period for these complex processes. Furthering the transparency of this, Frank mentioned we've responded to 1,800 data requests. There is not one stone unturned related to the costs that go into this. And there's going to be public hearings starting later this month to which the public can attend either in person or you can view on Pura's YouTube website. From there, I guess I will close my comments here, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy Prescott, who's going to talk about energy procurement in a deregulated market. So I'll turn it to you. Thank you.
I didn't have a joke, but I was going to ask how many utility representatives does it take to turn on a microphone? So there you go. Thank you, Kenna. So my name is Christy Prescott. I'm the Director of Wholesale Power Contracts at United Illuminating. And I'm going to provide you information today regarding how UI procures energy for our customers. And you'll notice that my comments will have a very similar trend as Mr. Shuckrow from Eversource, considering we follow the same rules and process, but I think it bears repeating. As you're aware, after deregulation in 1998, the state required utility companies to sell our generation assets and provide the opportunity for customers to purchase power through third-party suppliers. But our utility companies did maintain the role of delivering power to our customers via our transmission and distribution systems. But deregulation introduced a competitive retail market for energy supply. So although there is retail energy supply markets, the state law recognized that in cases where customers didn't choose to move to a retail supplier, that there had to be a default option for our customers. And that default option is provided by the utility companies, and that introduces the concept of standard service. That's the term. That's the default service or standard service that we offer to our customers who don't choose to be on a retail supplier. They stay with UI, we procure the power for them. I think it's important to highlight that we purchase this energy again for our customers, and we provide that energy to them for the same price that we pay for it. There is no markup. And another point, again, similar to what Mr. Shuckrow offered, was that when deregulation occurred, it was believed that the utilities would just be offering the standard service for the amount of time they took for our customers to choose retail suppliers. But yet, more than 20 years later, more than 85% of our customers are on standard service. Next slide, please. So again, the purpose that we talked about earlier about laddering is to minimize risks to price fluctuations when procuring our standard service. That's our goal. We hold 4 procurements per year under the direction of Pura's procurement manager, along with representatives from the Office of Consumer Counsel. And we conduct those procurements quarterly. Typically, we're conducting those in January, April, July, and October. And we divide the year into 2 service periods. Service period 1 runs from January 1st through June 30th. And service period 2 runs from July 1st to December 31st. And again, we divide those service terms into 10% 10% pieces or tranches. And we issue RFPs and we require bidders to return bids to us by our bid deadline. We evaluate those bids that come in along with the procurement manager and the OCC. So our bid day is very organized and regimented. At 10 a.m. we receive bids and we review those bids to make sure that they're complete. And we forward those over to PURA, the OCC, and their consultants. And then from about 10 to 11 a.m. on bid day, we're reviewing those individually. We're looking at the bids. We're comparing them against the proxy prices, so the prices we would have expected to see if they're higher or lower. And we're ranking those bids by lowest to highest price. And then from about 11 to 12, we're meeting with the utility is meeting with OCC and PURA and the consultants, and we're talking about these conditions. We're making sure that we're all seeing things the same way. We're talking about the market conditions. We're talking about volatility in the market. We're talking about how much have we procured for that time period. Are those prices high right now? Do we want to postpone purchasing? Are they really good? Do we want to purchase a little more? So we're having these conversations so that we can be taking advantage of these market conditions. But it is ultimately the procurement manager who makes that final decision, the PURA procurement manager, regarding how much we purchase and from which bidders we purchase from. This laddering structure and strategy, where we're dividing the service term into 10 tranches and going to the market 4 different times prior to our service term to purchase energy, allows us to spread out the risk of being affected by price spikes and also avoid situations where UI could be exposed to longer term periods where we wouldn't be able to take advantage of lower prices. Next slide. This graphic is a pie chart that represents the different elements of the supply that we're actually purchasing during our bid day. Many people think we're buying just energy, but we're buying more than just energy. And this is known as we get one price. And in our terminology, we call that a bundled price. And that's prices where suppliers are providing all the elements necessary to serve our standard service load. In fact, the suppliers are also providing capacity. They're providing renewable energy certificates, or RECs, which are required as part of the Connecticut Renewable Portfolio Standards. Also, there are other elements, including ISO New England charges to administer the regional energy markets. There's distribution line losses, and there's also a risk premium that suppliers add in order to lower the risk of unexpected market conditions and may impact them over their service term. You know, we really do understand that our customers are affected during these times of high supply rates. This slide highlights our increased customer outreach that is ongoing across our service territory, where our customers can enroll directly in assistance programs. In fact, our next outreach event is scheduled for February 15th at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in New Haven. And in addition to this event, our public affairs team is continuously engaging with our municipal and community organizations to educate our customers on the availability of our assistance programs and partnerships. So that ends our formal presentation today, but we are happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you guys so much. Just want to, because both you guys and Eversource said the same thing. We're at a point today where if you look at your electric bill, it's about 70-30 supply. But if you go back 2 years, it was flipped the other way. And I was getting dozens and dozens of calls about how come your side of the bill is so expensive and the generation, I'm getting no power and I'm still paying all that money. So this is the equation of 70-30, 60-40, 50-50 is variable by period and by market circumstances. And I just wanted everybody to understand that the 70-30 is not fixed in stone. And yesterday's complaint went by the wayside and we have a new complaint today. So I'm going to leave it to my colleagues if they have any other questions.
Yeah, if I could I make a comment to that? And I don't disagree with you that fluctuations will always be there as they go up and down, again, primarily driven by energy prices. But history will repeat itself absent different structures being in place to mitigate that. If you look back to Hurricane Katrina, when it hit Texas back in 2012, I can't remember exactly, we saw gas spike to unprecedented prices, $14, $15, $18 per MMBTU. Of course, those after the facilities were repaired, et cetera, prices came back down and had been at historical lows under $3 per MMBTU. They're higher now again because of the war. So again, volatility in fuel prices, especially natural gas, drives energy prices. And I think similar to what Eversource has said, similar to what ISO New England has said, different market mechanisms or different structures led by the state or participating by the state need to be in place to mitigate that price volatility. Because at the end of the day, customers and businesses want predictability more than anything to make sure that they can budget and pay their bills. Thank you.
I agree with that 100%. And one could argue that there will be a higher frequency of weather-related events in the Northeast. I mean, the United States has no shortage of natural gas. And for a while, prices had dropped so low that they were capping wells because there was no value in pumping it out of the ground. In the Northeast, we have a distribution problem, obviously, and all the best laid plans about building a second pipeline coming out of Pennsylvania, which would have solved every problem 10 years ago when they first talked about natural gas as a bridge fuel, when the prices had come down so that all the generators switched over to natural gas. We didn't really drive that. The market kind of drove that because generators are merchant generators and they're going to buy the least expensive fuel that they can buy. And still, even today, the price of natural gas is back down below $3. It was at $2.40 or $2.35 a couple of days ago. The market equilibrates, and after Hurricane Katrina, there was a spike because all those platforms were taken offline. Things happen and will happen, and they're likely to happen in a more increasing way over time with climate change. But natural gas is still relatively expensive, and when we measure everything against the baseline cost of that fuel, it's really difficult to get people to switch. So 95% of the year it's below. We have a war, unusual circumstance, but even that global supplies sort of move where they move. We're constrained because the price of LNG is, now going to Europe to keep them warm in the winter, and we're paying a little bit more for that. And I said this last time, I just want to remind people that there are great sacrifices being made to support democracy in a part of the world distant from us where we don't feel it, but we're feeling some impact on the price. And it doesn't make life easier. And we're taking every step that we possibly can to mitigate some of the impact on the poorest people, the people that can't afford it. But in reality, huge sacrifices are being made by people right now in order to support the world order that we've sort of created. And I think personally, I think that's a worthwhile cause. And I don't want to intermingle the longer term problem with this war. I'm not sure that I agree with what Jim had said before, that we're seeing a new market normal here because the minute that the weather turned warmer for the winter, prices came back down. So I'd love to have a way to get natural gas to New England from Pennsylvania because you can almost throw it this far, but we just don't. And I don't see any way to do it. I don't see New York allowing it. I don't see anybody paying for the pipeline at this point. So backing up this grid is critical. And I would not want to be the one who predicts how much gas we're using in 20 years. I wouldn't put my money on it. Let me leave it to you that way. So states have to do what they have to do, and they have to find a way to get around this. And I am encouraged by one thing right now, that the governors of these states are finally talking to each other and recognizing that we have a regional problem that we need to resolve. And that may mean paying rent on the terminal in Boston Harbor. Whatever it is, we need to think as a whole, not as individual states. And I think that's happening. I congratulate and applaud Governor Lamont for doing that now with Commissioner Dykes. There's a lot of conversations going on about transmission that's different than had been in the past. And hopefully the problem that we know we've been living with for 7 or 8 years now, we can begin to address in a more regional way. So thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, could you go back to slide number 5, please? I know today is generator day, but I want to talk for a moment about the delivery side of the equation. You characterized 2 of the 3 bars as being effectively flat, but I perceive an uptrend on both of those. If you were to project the direction of those 2 lines, meaning transmission and distribution going forward, would you say it's fair to suggest those lines will maybe not move up as precipitously as the supply, but will continue to grow perhaps more significantly than they have in the recent past?
Sure, I haven't calculated those projections or viewed anything that might be projected from ISO New England based on planned investment for the region. And those graphs are out there. I don't have those at my fingertips today. But I will say large investments for utility infrastructure across the country happened in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Those assets are and will be reaching end of life. Aging infrastructure is dangerous to the system because it's weak, and it means reliability decreases, reliability and resiliency decrease. In a day where in our modern lives, the expectation is that the lights come on our TV stream Netflix any hour of every day, there is little tolerance to have outages. So investment in both transmission and distribution infrastructure is necessary. It will come. I think that we will, if I were to guess, again, not having performed the analysis, that the trends will remain fairly flat because as those assets depreciate, that takes down and lowers the rate to match capital investment to try, a goal is to try to maintain those rates, right? Now, sometimes investment is lumpy, meaning a large transmission, building large scale transmission is very expensive today. And as those assets come in, it means a spike in your rate base, which means a spike in rates. But there are mechanisms that are regulatory mechanisms that can be used to smooth that. And again, I think in partnership with PURA, for good, bad, or indifferent, PURA is our business partner as a regulated monopoly. And as they have the authority to review, set, and regulate our rates, our work with them is important to think about that rate impact to customers and to ensure investments that are in the best interest of customers are being made. And again, as I had stated earlier, that regulation needs to be balanced to ensure utilities are healthy and thriving, because that is in the best interest of customers to have good ratings, procure debt at low rates, and to continue to make investments to keep reliability and resiliency in check.
Thank you.
And Rep. Steinberg, I'll just add to that and just echo the comments I made earlier, which is, again, we're going through a process right now. We've had 1,800 interrogatories or data requests that have come through. So we're very transparent and forthcoming in terms of making sure that we justify those investments that need to be made at reasonable rates.
Thank you. I would agree that Connecticut suffers from aging infrastructure virtually across the board. And one might view the electric grid as a bit of an albatross for the utilities in terms of maintaining it, let alone upgrading it. And that's really what I think we're going to see coming out of the PURA dockets, the need to make significant investments. And at the same time, with the advent of offshore wind and a lot of remote resources, we'll need to make huge investments in the transmission network. So I'm not sure I'm as sanguine as you are about keeping those curves flat. If depreciation is our saving grace, that's probably not a great indicator. I guess our only silver lining are the federal dollars currently available, which might mitigate some of the impact on ratepayers. But I remain concerned that the distribution and the delivery side of the equation is going to have an impact on ratepayers going forward for the foreseeable future until we get to a point where we have the grid for the future. So even though there's a lot of focus today on generation, I want to keep everybody focused on the fact that we are looking at significant investments for the foreseeable future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And yeah, along those lines, as our grid becomes more distributed with generation, solar, wind, other more distributed forms of generation, how do you see that affecting the volume of needs to build out more distribution and transmission? And obviously that would imply that the amount of distribution and transmission costs per kilowatt hour ultimately paid by the consumer goes up. But what type of magnitudes do you think about when you think about a more distributed generation type of power grid in the future?
So I guess I'll start and pass it off to our team here. So I think it was commented earlier that, we need to be able to move the energy to where those load pockets are. So as we look to electrify more in terms of EVs, electrify heating, and anything that will drive electricity consumption, we need to make sure that we're making investments in the distribution system to harness the distributed energy resources and move the power to where it's most needed. So we always do that with a keen eye on making sure that we're doing it at the most affordable rates. And I won't get into a lot of the details here in terms of our competitive process that we go through in terms of procurements and in terms of getting not only suppliers and utilizing our worldwide influence in terms of being a part of a global company so that we can procure at a extremely low rate by leveraging volume. But we employ those practices each and every day with each and every procurement, whether it's for services or for supplies, and that's embedded in the rates that we put forth within our rate cases. Anything else to add to that?
I'll just add one piece is that I agree transmission investment is going to be needed, especially to bring clean energy resources into fruition, to incent them to be built. And so transmission is at the core, I think, of any piece of the clean energy transition, both for onshore and offshore resources.
I was just going to also add to further the response to your question. We're responsible for administering a lot of different programs for the clean energy transition, including both in front of the meter and behind the meter programs. And Pura alluded to many of the dockets that they have in process and programs which we're administering as a utility, including what used to be called the LREC-ZERIC program, or the low and zero emission renewable energy credit program, which is replaced by the non-residential renewable energy solutions program. We have shared clean energy. We also have a lot of utility scale procurements, which we have long-term contracts, and we're working on bringing those projects in with those developers and providing a long-term 20-year offtake for those contracts. And that's providing that sort of market. It's removing it from the market and giving a long-term utility offtake contract, which has been helpful to get those projects completed and built and in service.
Senator Piscopo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really like that redesign bill you had on that on this one of the slides. I think that if the public's clamoring for anything, it's a better explanation just simply of what's in their bill. And I especially like the public policy part on the last one in red there, or in orange. And that could get interesting. That could be interesting reading, because we have to point a finger at ourselves about some of the policies we create that drive up costs. I mean, we've been, I remember a special session in the summer, well, maybe late summer, early fall, after a storm that was forecast to be a glancing blow to Connecticut, whacked the Northeast from Ohio down to Maryland up to the Canadian border. And the public was out of power and they were upset. And we came in with that kind of reaction to just do something about it. And we created a lot of mandates on the utilities, and that would drive up costs, of course. And in both the slides from both presenters today, you see 2021 and then a spike right after 2021. That a lot of that could be to do with the action of the federal government, taking actions on supply policy. They cut down they stopped all new drilling, all new fracking. And so that's to be calculated in speculation of supply. Of course, it's going to drive up the rates. So that's got to come into point too. And I agree with the Senate chair about the war. The war is taking a lot of liquid, we just have to help those in Europe that have, with liquefied gas. So public policy does do a lot to drive up rates, and we've got to be conscious of that. So you don't have to answer that question, but thank you very much. But you can comment if you'd like. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I can make one comment, I agree that, markets survive competitive prices and will incent the most cost efficient supply. Public policy has a broader view to say, if we want to make a change, such as, diversification of supply or moving to clean energy, that is needed to modify, right? Or the public policy is going to drive a change in structure or that market behavior. If you look to California as an example, a state that is decades ahead of the Northeast in terms of implementation of clean energy, their prices had spiked above most of the country, high prices. But today, when you compare their energy prices to that of New England, they're almost on par. And so I think it is possible to implement public policy towards clean energy and still maintain prices that are competitive, across the country. Of course, every part of the region has different influences, many influences on price. The middle of the country is different than the Northeast, the South, and of course the West Coast. So just an example.
Representative Cheeseman, thank you.
Thank you. One of your slides indicated that in a typical procurement, you get 4 to 6 bidders. And we had heard from Eversource, I believe, that going forward, looking at this particular period, there was a dearth of bidders. Can you comment on that in terms of what you actually saw in terms of the number of people, the bidders actually wanting to enter into the process with you?
Sure. The typical number of bidders in our slide does say 4 to 6. In the last few procurements, that has been reduced significantly. And so I would agree with Mr. Shekaro's comment of more recent procurements. When we've asked bidders, we have an opportunity for bidders to notify us that they're coming in. So we have some prediction of what we should be expecting on bid day. We've asked, our typical bidders, if they're not participating, kind of why. There hasn't been a lot of information provided from them since they're not mandated to provide that information, but I would say that I think it's just concern over the market volatility. Again, a reminder for the generators who bid and provide our service are exposed to what the actual market conditions are. And so if the bid price that they bid for us is, say, $125, they're getting paid $125 megawatt hour. Well, if the market price is $50, they've just made a lot of money potentially. But if the market price goes up to $200, they've lost money. And so that's why they provide that risk premium and why we expect that to happen in their bid allowances. But that's ultimately, I think, why folks stepped away. There was concern about, particularly in this time period, that first half of 2023, the scarcity of market conditions and also some other very specific market conditions in generating assets about whether and how they were going to be compensated in ISO New England. And I think that may have made them pause for that particular time period.
Is that 15% risk premium standard in every bid contract? I mean, could they tweak that? To
Yeah,
cover their tails, if
that's-
they, as it were?
Yes, I think that that's just a depiction of what we've typically seen. That's not a set percentage. That's a analysis that we do when we do what we call our energy proxy pricing. So we do a proxy. The Public Utility Regulatory Authority's procurement manager produces a proxy as well as OCC. And so the reason for that is that we all do it a little bit different. Some folks go into a futures market, so, you know, different futures markets, and you look at what do we think is coming down the line for that typical time period? What are the weather predictions, geopolitical issues? What are some sort of things that may be affecting bidder behavior or market conditions?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Volatility and risk are the enemy here. And there's always somebody who's willing to buy risk. It's just at what price. And that's what happened here. I don't think that the generators themselves keep the risk. I think they flip it. And that's where the people who buy and trade risk make money. You can make a lot, you can lose a lot. And I had one question for Eversource that I didn't ask them, two actually, that I'm going to ask you guys. One is, you think overall the ratepayer benefited from deregulation? That's for Frank.
Well, I guess, Senator, it depends on what deregulation was supposed to achieve. Was it supposed to achieve lower prices? Was it supposed to achieve reliability? Was it supposed to achieve innovation in the market? I suspect the jury's still out on all of that as we sit here today, because we have a reliability concern. I think we see price volatility, and perhaps we've seen a little bit of innovation. So I will leave it at that.
Well, I guess that's an answer. My last thing is, and just for my own elucidation here, the constant refrain of property taxes come up in the fact that municipalities, mine included, benefit from receiving property tax payments from the electric company. I don't know if that's common throughout the country, but is that a recoverable cost?
Yes. And that is common across the country, having worked in various utilities across the country. Property taxes are a component, they're a cost of doing business. They are a component of rate base and are prudently incurred costs that are recovered.
So just to translate that, I'm not sure if all states do that, but when we talk about recoverable, it means that you earn a rate of return on the property taxes that you pay.
Thank you for that point. That was not my intent. I think there are two components that I think of when you think of a revenue requirement. One is utilities are authorized to earn a return of costs incurred to run the business. Return of meaning cost of service without a markup, right? Just the actual cost. Property taxes would be a cost. There's no markup or return on that. The second component is that risk for investment of capital. That's the return on. So if you think of the two buckets, operation and maintenance cost is just a return of those without a markup, but the return on is an opportunity to earn up to the authorized return on equity that the state commission in all states or FERC establish. It's not a guarantee. It's an opportunity to perform to get there. And so just keeping in mind those two pieces, I didn't mean to infer that we earned a premium on property taxes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. And so it's similar to the pass-through rate for a standard service. You're not allowed to earn your rate of return on that. So you don't earn a rate of return on property tax or income tax or any of that stuff.
Exactly.
I don't see anybody else having questions. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for your patience, and thank everybody else for their patience. We're still falling behind. Next up is NEPCA, New England Power Generators Association. We decided not to invite individual power generators, but associations where possible, who can speak to what they do and what role in the marketplace the generators play. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Needleman, Chairman Steinberg, and members of the committee. My name's Dan Dolan. I'm president of the New England Power Generators Association. I'm here with my colleague Molly Connors, and as Chairman Needleman noted, we're the organization that represents the vast majority of power generators. In fact, we represent over 90% of the electric generating capacity across the 6 states of New England, including here in the state of Connecticut. Within our membership, we see thousands of employees working at nearly 400 individual generating sites with a diverse fuel and technology resource base across the region, representing every different fuel and technology that produces electricity that then delivers that into the homes and the businesses that truly powers the economy of New England overall. There's been a lot of discussion about what has happened over the last 25 years now, since 1998 and 1999, when most of the New England states did restructure the electricity industry. And I want to talk a little bit about what are the roles and responsibilities of a power plant owner within this market to deliver reliability, cost competitive pricing, and an increasingly clean generation fleet overall. But I also feel that I have to respond for now the 3rd time in 6 weeks, the public illusions of collusion and market manipulation that senior executives at Avangrid have made against my members and their behavior in the market. It's frankly irresponsible without having any facts, figures to back up any of that. All of those types of accusations violate the rules of the New England market that is federally regulated and is very closely overseen by independent market monitors with heavy criminal and civil penalty authority for that type of behavior. And frankly, it's not how we've been accustomed to have to operate in front of this committee for nearly 20 years, in which we've enjoyed the opportunity of being able to discuss on a solutions-based path forward. And I do want to get into that. But unfortunately, I felt the need that to respond to that and not leave that unanswered in front of you all. What generators do have the responsibility to do is to provide reliability of service, availability, commitments to making sure that they can operate every single day. And in fact, within the New England electricity market, any operating power plant that receives a commitment to be a reliability resource in the region has what's called a must offer obligation, which means every single day it must make that facility available in both the day ahead electricity market and the real time electricity market to actually power the homes and businesses across the region. It is an obligation we take extraordinarily seriously, and something that our more than 4,000 plant employees across the region operate, including like just this past weekend when we saw a historic cold snap across much of the region through storms, and particularly during the early days of COVID, taking extraordinary steps to oftentimes having to house on site at these facilities because we cannot go short this commodity, as we well know. As part of that, it is also a very closely overseen market overall. There is a 2-step mitigation process within any offer, both overseen by an independent market monitor housed as part of ISO New England, as well as the federally overseen markets from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. As part of that, we also know that electricity is an extraordinarily volatile commodity, and I've got some of the same pricing slides that you've seen from others, and so I'm not going to go through those in any great detail. but certainly pre the Russia invasion in Ukraine, we saw a volatile commodity here, but a pretty strong trend line over the last nearly 20 years of enormous efficiencies of supply leading to consumer savings. And to answer Senator Needleman, yes, the restructured electricity market has delivered enormous benefit to consumers here in Connecticut across the region. At the same time, and looking at a little bit of a different axis here, the transmission costs have exploded in New England, where New England now pays twice the transmission rate of nearly any organized electricity market in the United States. Certainly, we do need to reinvest in our roads, bridges, and infrastructure. This is truly how we get our product to market. It is our delivery infrastructure. It can't be underinvested in. But it's also one in which we've seen extraordinary increases leading over time to a convergence as we look at the energy coming out of the power plant sold into the centralized New England market and the cost of the transmission overall. As part of that, we also have a separate forward capacity market. That's an annual auction that is held to be committed resource online 3 years into the future. It's our signal for new plants to come online, and it's also the retirement signal. It's our first time we see older facilities exit the market, trying to pair that exit and entry to ensure that we do have sufficiency of supply and capacity on the market. I'm also proud that through the efficiencies driven by this market, we've seen an extraordinary environmental performance, with emissions having fallen precipitously as we have seen the need for fewer power plants today to provide power than what we saw under a vertically integrated system that is created then a very nimble system, switching fuels and being able to drive efficiencies. Today, this is where the electricity comes from. And again, you saw very similar slides from some of the prior speakers. So now looking forward, and where do we go from here? What happens with all this? There's two elements that I think have rightfully garnered the most attention, and it's price and reliability. On the reliability aspect, it's true. You know, New England has been wrestling with winter energy supply issues, not just since 2015, as Senator Needleman said. There was actually a FERC investigation of a cold snap going back to 2004. This has been a perennial issue. Winter's always coming in New England. And so as we look at this, what the market is trying to focus on now is sharpening. What are those reliability qualifications? What does it mean for each of these fuel and resource types to get a commitment in that forward capacity market to truly be able to deliver on the reliability services? It's something called capacity accreditation. How do you accredit a resource for reliability benefit? Part of this is for what have been some of the more commonly known intermittent resources, is understanding what is their capability under different weather conditions. Some for natural gas resources here in the region where we do have a constrained delivery system, it's understanding what is their true capability to operate and get the fuel necessary. The same is true for all the various fuels and technologies. There is one exception to that on this graph, and that's that purple slice, the net imports, in which under the proposal being put forward by ISO New England, it is the only component of the overall system that is getting a full exemption from this sharper examination of its reliability contribution, and instead is being proposed to get 100% capacity factor, 100% delivery guarantee overall, despite the fact I'm not sure that's the case. So let's look at the two sharpest examples that we had just this winter. The first is on Christmas Eve, where we had only the second reserve shortage in the current market design we have, which is called pay for performance under the capacity market design. And under this design, if we start getting into a short reserve situation, which doesn't mean the lights go out. It just means that we start dipping into a bunch of those resources. We hold back from the market to make sure we've got sufficiency of supply. That's called a reserve shortfall. Under that, any resource that is not providing either energy or reserves in that moment, they get penalized regardless of the reason. You could be available and you just weren't dispatched, but you get penalized. And then any resource that fills that gap, that overperforms, they get a bonus payment. It's a net zero formula for the consumer. All the penalty payments go in to feed the bonus payment. So it's not more money out of the consumer's pocket, but it's how we judge the tightness of the system. And it's how we try and drive incentives to reinvest in facilities and make sure you're online for when the system needs it the most. On Christmas Eve, we saw coincident with this reserve shortfall, which happened between the hours of 4:40 p.m. and 6:05 p.m. Happened to coincide almost precisely with when the imports we received from Hydro-Quebec started to get cut off, and we lost over 700 megawatts. In some periods of time, we lost nearly 1,000 megawatts from what had been committed in the day-ahead market, but was not delivered in real time, and coinciding exactly with that shortage event. Now, in fairness, we also saw some faults on the generator end. There were a number of facilities that had mechanical failures. There were some facilities that had emissions limits that restricted their capability to run, particularly as we get to the end of the year and we see emissions credits run out. That becomes a constraint. And there were also some timing issues in which, because this was a fairly last minute event in terms of the shortfall we saw coming out of Quebec, for some facilities that take longer than 30 minutes to turn on, get these big complicated machines to turn on, sometimes take several hours. All those facilities that weren't online, they were the ones penalized. Nevertheless, it's hard to look past the coincidence of the timing of that event. The second one happened just this past Friday into Saturday, in which, again, we saw historic cold across much of this region. I live in southern Maine, and that morning when I got up to take the dog outside, it was -20 real temperature, -45 with the wind chill. It was cold. And yet we saw, I think, extraordinary performance across the region from the generator fleet. What's true on a basis of geography is Quebec obviously sees basically the same overall weather patterns we do. They just see it a little bit worse in winter. And Quebec saw historic electricity demand up there, to the point that Hydro-Quebec had to put out public calls for conservation of electricity use in the early morning hours on Saturday morning. And it was throughout those early morning on Saturday that for the first time that I have ever seen in my 20 years of paying pretty close attention to the New England electricity market, that New England Generators actually shipped 1,000 megawatts throughout that several hours up to Quebec to keep the lights on in Quebec. And as part of that, fortunately, we also had more than adequate supplies, more than adequate reserves, so that there was no reliability shortfall here in the region. And so the reason I am putting this in front of you is to ask for some help in making sure that as we do take a sharper look at reliability across the board, as we have to with each of my individual members, let's also look at that other slice of the system that today is being excluded from that same sharper look. And that brings us to, how do we design this electricity market for the future that we know is coming? We need to better identify what are those reliability products, particularly as we do look to electrification of broader swaths of the economy, as we see more weather-dependent resources that are absolutely necessary to meet our clean energy mandates overall. That's going to require a different contribution from the rest of the grid to help maintain that reliability in a cost competitive manner overall. So let's look at what are those reliability products we need. Let's sharpen the definitions of the reliability contribution that individual types of resources provide. Sometimes that's going to mean that those products have to then drive a different set of fuel procurements to create more stability in operations and sufficiency overall. And then I've been a broken record in front of this committee for several years, but we have one big hole left in this market, which is that we have public policies in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Maine, driving towards decarbonization, and yet we do not fundamentally value decarbonization. If we want the markets to help lead to clean energy, we need to actually value the attribute. And this is true both for the new resources that are needed to come in, as well as preserving the existing resources that we expect to continue to contribute to decarbonization into the future. And so finally, to return to Senator Needleman's question about the benefits of restructuring, yes. We have seen tens of billions of dollars of new infrastructure investment come in without state guarantees in the form of over 8,000 megawatts of new facilities, both here in Connecticut and in other states in New England. We have seen cost competition coming from these 400 different power plants across the region that have to compete against each other every single day. But these markets aren't perfect. We do need to do better. We do need to continue to focus on winter reliability, sharpen the affordability question, and making sure that we can create a sustainable economy for this overall. And once and for all, start in earnest the investment cycle that's necessary to transition to a cleaner and decarbonized fleet. With that, happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I had to run out for a minute. I would have expected no less of an answer from NEPCA, and I certainly understand it. And there have been pluses and minuses, in my opinion, and it's hard to weigh that. You know, that from some point of view, the weighting goes in terms of where's it less expensive, where's it more expensive, but there are so many factors that go into cost, and I don't know at this moment that given the way FERC regulates ISO, that we have a mechanism for regional decarbonization that would actually work, because NEPCA or the power generators have equal voice, if not a louder voice, at ISO New England. You have a system that perpetuates incumbent power generators. So it's complicated. I think I would never say that there has been no value brought to the system by the competition. It's just whether it, and I'm asking everybody the same question, except I forgot to ask Eversource. So short-term memory loss.
Well, Senator, could I answer
Sure.
The implicit question around carbon pricing? Because look, electricity is a little complicated because it falls in this funny space between state and federal jurisdiction, right? Where the state has jurisdiction over many of these individual facilities. They are cited by the state, taxed by the state, all the rest of it. And yet the transactions are interstate in nature, and so therefore federal. One of the elements that Connecticut does control, along with the other individual New England states, however, are emissions protocols. And in that, to the degree that Connecticut, in concert with some of the other New England states, does decide to move forward on putting in place a meaningful price on carbon emissions, just like the states came together under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is not sufficient to drive investment one way or another. That is something that is within the state jurisdiction, and to levy that value.
As long as they all agree, and updating Reggie is obviously part of it. You know, it's a longer conversation. I don't want to take any time with it, but doing this one state, even one region at a time, even one country at a time, as we're trying to mitigate a global catastrophe here, is something that is not necessarily the best way to solve this problem. I do want to just highlight one thing that you said, which I firmly believe, and that is that the transmission lines that will come out of Quebec all the way down here will be a two-way road. That there will be times that we're going to be able to ship extra power up to Quebec, and there'll be times when they'll be able to ship it down here. And I think I've said this before, not my original thought, but thinking of the Northeast, which includes the Maritimes and Quebec as one region, is sort of a better way to visualize what a regional transmission network. It doesn't end at the main border.
Sure, and look, the electrons certainly don't recognize those international boundaries, and the existing interties do work that way. They are those two-way flows.
Right.
The one amendment I'd add to that is, however, that the proposal for the Northeast Clean Energy Connect, which has been mentioned a couple times, is not being proposed as two-way flow. The way that it is being engineered is a one-way extension core down into New England.
Thank you. Chairman Steinberg.
Thank you, Chairman Edelman. Let's stay on carbon charge for 50, please. As someone who is, I know I'm dating myself a little bit. But who is? If I could focus on my question. As it relates to carbon charges, I and a number of legislators from a variety of states have been pushing this for more than a half dozen years. We were co-opted, perhaps to some degree, by the governor's transportation climate initiative, which I might characterize as having failed spectacularly, and we're nowhere. Partially because there are real differences in the interests of the states themselves. I'm pleased to hear that industry is supportive of the concept. You know, we succeeded with Reggie. We may succeed with winning a hydrogen hub contract grant from the federal government. What's it going to take for us to come together on a carbon charge that is going to work across the huge diversity of the New England states?
Thank you, Chairman Steinberg, and certainly, you know, you and your counterpart in Massachusetts, Senator Michael Barrett, have been leaders on this for a long time. And honestly, the failure of TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, makes it that much harder. Because part of it is, while we focus a lot rightfully on electricity, if we only look at embedding an explicit price on carbon in electricity, I actually think that's a failure. Because as we look at the overall economic picture, the real goal is to drive decarbonization wherever it is more efficient. That the climate doesn't care where the emissions come from. And given that over the next at least decade plus, the vast majority of those emissions reductions in the places that do actually drive the overall emissions profile, being transportation and home and business heating, are going to be predicated on electrification. If all we're doing is raising the price of electricity by explicitly embedding a carbon price within it and ignoring the carbon emissions within the traditional transportation and heating fuels, we are creating an implicit subsidy for those fossil fuels in transportation and heating. So what I would suggest is, if we are going to be truly successful in using carbon pricing to drive both behavioral change and a financeable base for the tens of billions of dollars of new investment that's going to be necessary, it actually needs to be a multi-sector carbon price. I didn't say economy-wide, because it doesn't have to be economy-wide, but it has to focus on where we're trying to drive emissions down. And if we can hit the big three of power generation, transportation, and heating, we pretty much get to where we need to go over the next couple of decades in New England.
Well, as you know, those who scream bloody murder the most are the mom and pop home oil suppliers, and to the degree that they are included in this seems to create problems. The other issue we have, I notice you didn't mention a gas tax or something along those lines. We get tremendous resistance in talking about any sort of carbon charge when it appears to be a direct tax that impacts. Is there a way to overcome those factors, legacy sources and direct impact on consumers?
So certainly the direct impact on consumers, I actually think is the simplest within that, because the states then control the revenues that come from all of this tax, just as it does with any other tax or valuation. And I think the way to get this done on a sustainable manner is to ensure to the maximum extent possible for the individual consumer, they are largely held harmless within that. And it's a cap and dividend type of an approach, tax and dividend, any number of different terms you want to use. There's pretty straightforward ways through this. The much harder piece is the politics. And yet, if decarbonization is truly going to be the driver of or the prism through which we look at energy policy, as it has been in Connecticut for several years now, to me, it's a failure that we don't explicitly look at what is the outcome we're trying to get at. But trust me, I recognize I just painted a big red target on my back, and such is life.
Well, I'll share that target with you. I agree. I think the failure is directly related to failure to communicate. We need to do a much better job on that side. I'm going to change gears with one more question. You may not like it as well. I feel very badly that the utilities took shots at you with regard to how your industry operates, but I'm going to take the bait. You've heard a call by the utilities for the generators to join the relief effort and make a contribution, a la what the utilities have made to mitigate some of the impact on ratepayers. There's also been calls, whether in Europe or nationally, for a windfall profits tax on fossil fuel companies under these extreme circumstances. In the recognition of the fact that the generators are making huge profits right now, these ideas are gaining currency. What's your response?
I'm fascinated to see where these profits are.
Well, I guess we'd be interesting because that's the general impression, certainly.
So look, as we've talked about and has been described several times here, the vast majority of what we are seeing driving the increase, particularly on the default rate and the overall electricity prices across the region, are higher fuel costs. Those costs are the largest individual cost for the vast majority of generators across the region. And if we posit for a moment that this is a competitive market in which individual market participants are truly playing according to the rules and under the regulations that have been put forward by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, then they must bid their competitive price, or else one of their competitors will undercut whatever premium or other profit-seeking price that they put into the market, and that therefore they are reflecting the true overall cost that they bear. Within that structure, it is what's called a uniform clearing price market, which means a single price is set for that last increment of supply needed to meet demand in any given moment. Within that, there are going to be winners and losers across the marketplace. But what we've seen consistently, both in this market over the last couple of years, and last year in particular, is a very tight revenue market with revenue requirements laid out by the independent market monitor that do not show windfall profits or any manipulation or gaming of the market overall. To the point that I think is underlying a lot of this on the impact to consumers, we absolutely see that. We live here too, right? And we see extraordinary contributions from a number of individual companies to places like Operation Fuel administered here in Connecticut. We also see the fact that we're trying to reinvest within these facilities to maintain the operations and the level of reliability that's needed. There was a comment earlier that we burned a lot of oil on Christmas Eve to get through that tight reliability event. And yet, what I'm particularly proud of is that 7 to 10 days after all of that oil was burned, the oil tanks were back up to within 1% of their fill levels that they were going into that weekend, which meant that companies weren't just taking the money that they earned in the market and pocketing it, but were reinvesting to make sure that we get through the rest of this winter as necessary as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh. So you said that looking at the generators, you should build in a price for reliability and factor that in. Does that mean that if you're, you can run at 90% capacity factor, you get more, and if you're running at 40% capacity factor, you get less? Because obviously, when we're looking at renewables, we're not looking at a 95% capacity factor. I'm just curious as to see how you would see that play out.
Absolutely. And so the way it would work is that on a, say, kilowatt basis, everybody gets a same rate per kilowatt. But if you were a facility that, say, could run at 95% capacity factor, then depending on your size, you would make more on an absolute basis than a facility that could only operate on a 40% capacity factor basis. But it would be an equal rate on a kilowatt basis that would then be factored on that 95% or 40% or whatever is the capacity factor for the individual resource.
Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Fazio.
Mr. Dolan, thank you for your testimony. You mentioned before that that we still have a lot of these generators kind of popping up, even though it's not a coordinated process necessarily. It's not like a case with the offshore wind where you have an enormous PPA, and that's supposed to be the premise of the restructured, so-called deregulated market, that you have decentralized actors responding to price, and so they create supply when there's a return. Now looking ahead 20 years, we're the ISO presentation is top of mind for a lot of us, and we also know that a lot of so there's a supply deficit over 20 years. Do we still anticipate that sort of decentralized supply response? Like, maybe there's not as much to worry about because you'll see price high enough that'll create the incentive for new investment to build new generators. And then I guess the counterpoint to that would be, well, there's just not going to be enough because the generators would theoretically be gas, and there's not going to be enough gas supply for that. Tell me if you disagree with any of that analysis.
I think we're in a muddled middle period that is going to look different than what the history was. So you're right. I pointed out that over the last decade, we've built and invested in roughly 8,000 megawatts of new generating capacity. The vast majority of that was natural gas. I am of the belief that we should not expect to see any major new natural gas infrastructure built into New England anytime soon, if ever. At the same time, we are also clearly close watchers of what the states are doing. And Connecticut, like Massachusetts and other states, has sent a clear signal to the market, to my members, to not invest in new facilities on a merchant basis because of the thousands of megawatts that are receiving guaranteed contracts directed by the states. And so if you're a rational actor in the market and you see the state creating a subsidy of supply for a particular resource type, be that offshore wind or solar or some other resource type, and even if there is a short-term tightness in the market, it would be imprudent to make a multi-billion-dollar investment in a facility that could potentially relieve that short-term constraint if over the next several years and for decades to come, there are going to be thousands of megawatts of supply that undercut your very investment because they've got a 20 or 30-year locked-in long-term contract. And so before we see the commercial operation of all those contracted resources that are presumably eventually coming, we're dealing with a really uncomfortable middle period in which the market is tight. There does not feel like there is a great answer to how unlock that market. And I agree with Mr. Daly. It's about maximizing the infrastructure we do have and making sure that we are ensuring that those resources can meet the reliability needs overall. So I know that's probably not a direct answer, but that's how I would back into it.
And then when you say the states are saying, don't invest in any new capacity, are the, what do you mean by that? Are you saying that they're saying it explicitly or implicitly?
Implicitly.
And go ahead.
By the fact that we see this arms race around offshore wind of the targets of the thousands of megawatts, again, here in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, across the board of those aren't permissive statutes. It's not a may, it's a shall. And so as we see those contracts starting to get promulgated, the RFPs hitting the streets, the expectation is that they're actually going to deliver and they are actually going to meet their commercial operation date. Now,
But there's still going to be a shortage. There's still going to be a supply shortage. And even if you expand generation by 5-10 gigawatts, we still think that 20 years from now, we're still going to be in a shortage of 10-20 gigawatts.
If the states then also take the next step, which is driving the electrification that predicates that essentially doubling in demand. And right now we haven't seen those state policies.
So you don't believe the demand numbers?
I don't know. I believe them if the states are going to meet their decarbonization targets. And I believe those decarbonization targets should be met. What we are waiting to see is the signal that they are starting to be met, that they will be met. And now, look, the Inflation Reduction Act and what we're seeing at the federal level in pushing on electrification around vehicles and heat pumps, I do think that's going to have a meaningful contribution. Certainly, the manufacturing shifts that are occurring at the car makers is going to have an impact. But going back to the conversation with Chairman Steinberg, we're not seeing the clear through line linking the decarbonization requirements that should lead to that doubling of electricity demand with a matching on the generation side.
And last question, as the grid becomes more reliant on the intermittent sources, the lower capacity factors, and hydro is a higher capacity factor than a lot of the others, where do you see the gap being filled in supply? Again, I'm asking you to look into the future and predict the future, which is very difficult. But where theoretically should citizens, consumers imagine, when the wind's not blowing, when the lights are out, is the battery technology going to be there, et cetera?
So with the caveat that my crystal ball is awfully cloudy and cracked, it's going to be a combination of different sources. I don't think there's going to be any single savior or silver bullet within this. I think we continue to see natural gas play a large role in this market, probably at lower overall capacity factors as we stretch out into this decarbonized future. And then the question becomes what else comes in on a dispatchable stored fuel basis? There's discussions around hydrogen. Don't laugh, but there's lots of discussions around cold fusion. There are other technologies and resources that are going to have to step up and fill that gap as we look at a multi-decade process here, something that's not going to happen by 2030, but a progression over time.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Farrar.
Thank you, Senator. And Thank you for your testimony today. As usual, it's always very informative and makes me have to step back and think a little bit. And I listened intently to some of the comments you made, and obviously supply chain and gas availability, natural gas availability are going to be an issue for the future, especially if you're being told not to produce anymore or not to lay out new infrastructure. I do wonder though, we talk about decarbonization and there seems to be some folks that support a carbon tax and yourself being one of them. I think that'll probably be one of the most hotly debated subjects in this building. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is that a carbon tax would necessarily be, regressive with low-income folks. And in order to turn that carbon tax around and make it progressive, the question is going to be, how do you implement it, and where do you implement it along the supply chain? And I just think that that's a very uncomfortable position for many folks. The other thing that never seems to get into the conversation is, and I sit here and listen to, the various and sundry, all of the above energy sources, but we never talk about nuclear energy. And honestly, you're talking about decarbonization, what better form, what more effective form, economic form. The developments made in the nuclear industry now, as far as safety are concerned, are far more advanced than they were in the past. And why? I understand the negative implications around nuclear energy when we think back to Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and what have you. But I think the safety regulations have changed, and I think it's a viable form of energy that's cost effective and energy efficient. So just wanted to hear your comments on that.
No, I think nuclear is a remarkable resource that is going to be a huge component of the New England system for decades to come, particularly as we look at it at decarbonized future. We do represent the 2 remaining nuclear plants, certainly Millstone here in Connecticut and Seabrook in New Hampshire. That being said, I am not optimistic that we see another large scale nuclear reactor built, including at one of those existing sites. While their production costs and the marginal cost to produce electricity, nuclear makes it very cost competitive. The upfront capital costs are extraordinary. And while the regulations, the safety regulations have taken leaps and bounds over the decades, they've also made building new nuclear very difficult. And as we look at that and the overall challenges of financing and siting in New England, I'm not optimistic on that front. What could provide a potential opportunity for nuclear in New England is on the smaller scale, what are called modular reactors that can be sited and dispatched on a more distributed basis. There again, it's a fairly new and nascent technology in terms of its overall deployment. If we do start to see that take off, I think that provides a lot of promise. But that probably goes into the category in the discussion with Senator Fazio of resources that are a little bit around the corner that the technologies are going to have to step up to meet the needs and fill the gaps that we see in the future.
So just to double back on the suggestion of a carbon charge. How do you see, well, if the US were to adopt a carbon charge policy, how do you see them getting around the recession aspect of the tax?
I am not the taxation or expert, and there are folks who I'm sure could speak to it far more eloquently. And so my only response would be to agree with you that regressive nature is something that would absolutely have to be addressed were we to move forward with it.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. I think Representative Mashinsky's on, and I just again want to remind everybody that we're under a time constraint. We have 3 more people presenting after this. Thank you.
Okay. I've been listening on YouTube and then I switched over to Zoom. Very good presentation. But for the current speaker, how exactly do you pass a carbon tax, carbon pricing? I've tried 5 or 6 times with Representative Steinberg. And even with the version that is used in Canada, where they pay the dividend out to the customer, even that version couldn't even get out of Environment Committee. And TCI sank. How exactly do you recommend that what strategy do you recommend, or will you help us if we were to try to do this?
So that last one's the easiest. Yes, happy to help and do anything possible. I unfortunately am probably the wrong one to tell you how to get it done, because clearly after several years I have failed in every legislature in New England. The Massachusetts, one of the chambers in Massachusetts did pass it, but one chamber out of 12 in New England is not going to get the job done. And look, I do not look past the challenges and the extraordinary political lift that this is to get done. And yet we can do hard things, and I'm here to lend a hand, and to the degree that we can be supportive, we want to put the full weight and capabilities of our organization to support that type of a measure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And I appreciate the time. There's just so much here to think about, to try to get to the future that we want to get to. I'm afraid that somehow, some way, we seem to have sacrificed some reliability in the last decade or 2 decades. Haven't been involved long enough to know what the cause of it was. But I do want to address one of the things about affordability. When we did what we think was sort of landmark legislation, Take Back Our Grid, we were very thoughtful about putting in, low income rates, because we're recognizing that there's an inequity in the market here. And I think that rate makers are going to have to look at that carefully as we go forward, because there will be people who may not be able to support some of the efforts that many of us think we need to do to get to the other side of where we want to go for climate goals. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Up next is Connecticut Solar and Storage Association, formerly SolarCon. Again, reminding everybody that we are on a time constraint. I'm going to try to limit this to about 20 minutes between presentation and Q&A. As Representative Steinberg said, we are in overtime right now.
I think we're going to double it.
Great. Mr. Chairman, thanks for the invitation to speak today. Representative Steinberg, Senator Needleman. My name is Mike Trahan. I'm Executive Director of Solar Connecticut and the Connecticut Solar Storage Association. We're roughly 40 businesses in Connecticut, 20 of which install residential home solar systems, and another 20 that do commercial solar work across the state. A couple of our members do a little bit of both, and some of our members are also involved in the supply chain. We've been around for close to 10 years now. We've got nearly 60,000 residential solar systems installed or applied for in the state of Connecticut over the last 10 years. And we're a little better than 1,000 commercial projects developed under the ZREC program, and now the commercial solar tariff program that y'all passed last year. I should say before that I bring the appreciation of commercial developers for SB 176 last year, and the efforts by this committee to get that done. It's put a lot of people to work, and it's opened the door to a number of businesses who wanted to generate their own power. I'm happy today to be here to talk about ingrown, Connecticut grown power. Our members are have a lot of issues that they have on the table. But the invitation comes at an opportune time. I just put out a survey last week of our members asking them the following question. Will, can you help me? There's a lot of opinions out there of what residential installers should be doing, what commercial installers could expect of the legislature. I hate to be out here again with my hand out again this year after having a successful year last year on the commercial side, but y'all asked, so I'm here to tell you where we are. After asking the question, here's some of the responses that I'm getting from solar installers. Some of these issues are already been proposed in legislation already. A number of our members on the residential side are concerned that the time that it takes for utility companies to approve applications. The time has been where there's been significant delays, and there's been times where you can get an application passed in a couple of days. It just fluctuates to the point, makes it difficult for installers. This has been a years-long, multi-year-long process. We're in touch with the utilities. They've been, the distributed generation people at the utility companies have been very supportive of this, trying to see that they clear up this the backlog, but it remains a problem. Other states have put penalties in place for utilities on the customer service side or not meeting the deadlines that they're imposed on them to approve these applications on time. So that's one of the issues that installers have. There's a number of businesses. If you go back 2 years ago, pre-COVID, if you called the solar installer and asked them to come to your house and put solar on it, you could get it done and the system energized in about 90 days. Today, it's double, in part because of some supply chain issues, but also of a labor issue. There's a number of bills in front of the Planning and Development Committee that would change the 3-to-1 hiring ratio. Currently, right now, if you come out of the Connecticut Technical High School system with a focus on electricity and you knock on the door of a solar company, it's likely that they're going to turn you away because in Connecticut, there's a 3-to-1 ratio. You need to have 3 available journeymen to pair up with that one apprentice. There are apprentices out there, having finished the Connecticut Technical High School program, ready to work. I know there's a training bill before this committee. Training is great, but we've got trained people out there that want to work. We can't put them to work under this ratio right now. Next, Will, please. Terrific bill in place in this committee about energy efficiency. There's a requirement on residential home solar systems that a energy efficiency audit be performed. We're all for that. It used to be that the audit had to be performed before the solar was done. That requirement has changed. Right now, the audit just needs to be scheduled. There are funds through the utility companies that homeowners can access. Those funds have run out. They've been unreliable. It's very difficult at times for our members to find an energy efficiency company to do the audit right now. So having those dollars through this bill would be very, very helpful. Right now, one of the downsides to the residential tariff that was passed, that if you want to add solar onto your rooftop to create supply to address 2 electric vehicles, which you're allowed to do now. My understanding is that you can put a solar system on your rooftop. If you have no solar now, you can put a new system on your rooftop, taking consideration of future purchase of electric vehicles. But if you put solar on your rooftop 5 years ago and you want to add solar, you're not allowed to go through the netting process. You must go through the buy all sell all. There is, we think, statutory language that could change that would help help avert that. It's homeowners want to do that. They want to buy electric vehicles. They don't want to go through the buy all system. It doesn't make sense for them. They want a net meter. So we'll bring that to you. The last one, I just picked the top 5 here, actually, that I heard from residential contractors. There is a U.S. Department of Energy software available to municipalities across the country for free. Municipalities can use that to instantly permit their home solar systems. It's called Solar App. One of the first municipalities in Connecticut is Guilford, using it well. We're trying to pass around that experience to other municipalities to get them interested. Right now, one of the major backlogs to getting systems approved and up and energized is getting through that local permitting process. I don't have to tell you, I'm sure that some of your municipalities that you represent are short of inspectors, they're short of building officials.
it's become very difficult, I think, in some cases for municipalities to have people around. This sort of technology software would help them. And if there were funding to cover the IT costs, the municipalities would love to do a pilot program. Find 10 municipalities at $10,000 a piece for 100,000, 150,000, get them to run this for 6 months to prove its benefits to other municipalities. So that's it on the residential side. We did, as I say, we're very happy to have the commercial tariff passed last year. This last week was the first solicitation from utilities for new NRES projects, small commercial projects. And if we could go to the next slide there, Will. That's okay. Yeah, one more, please. Yep. So this is the a notice that email that was sent to solar developers, and it's sent from Eversource, and it was a similar one sent from UI. The small program sold out in 2 days. So while that is a red flag, it doesn't necessarily mean that the program is too small. I hate to say that, but I think the second solicitation would be very telling. Which happened in August. There's now 2 solicitations for commercial systems through the NRES program in Connecticut, whereas there has been for 10 years just one. But this is a red flag for us. It was unexpected, both on the utilities part and our part. There's a number of commercial developers who were ready to submit projects that couldn't because there is not enough space. The capacity has been reached, like I say, in 2 days. So to no surprise, the next slide, please, Will. Number 3, you can see that we installers on the commercial side would love to see the NRES and SCEF program caps lift. There is demand there. There's people who want to buy this power. SCEF power is the lowest price power around. I know we've got a nice little SCEF program, community solar program, and it addresses a couple thousand low and moderate income ratepayers, and it takes a couple of pennies off their kilowatt charge. But it's vastly underutilized. I shouldn't say underused. It's too small. I mean, instead of a couple thousand, we'd like to get 100,000 people using this power. Back to the top. I know this is it's been kind of a thorny issue. We've been to the committee for several years. I've been to planning development. We've been to finance. This year, we went to OPM at the direction of this committee for a study to be done on a uniform capacity tax, how commercial solar projects could be uniformly taxed at the local level. Right now, it's all over the place with pilots. It makes it very difficult for developers to pre-plan the cost of projects. We've got new language. The report that came out of OPM probably didn't solve the problem like we thought it would. So we've got new language to present to the committee. Number 2 here, we're all familiar with the virtual net metering projects. Right now, those projects are limited to just state agricultural municipal projects. We'd love to see that open back up to private property across the state. It's made an awful lot of sense, and it's put people to work, and it's helped those off takers as well to reduce their cost, especially municipalities, reduce their cost of power. Next one, please, Will. One more. There she goes. So back in 2017, I believe there were restrictions put on forest and farmland through the Environment Committee. There was concern that solar developers were plowing through those properties faster than the state could keep track of. There are good opportunities to develop solar on farmland that's not being used. Right? Farmland that's not being farmed right now. Farmland that, if there was solar on it, could help our farmers stay in business. We'd like to work with the committee and maybe the Environment Committee as well to see if there's some middle ground here that we could achieve to open up those parcels again. That is the lowest cost property around. And for solar developers and farmers to be told, no, you can't put solar on top of farm land that hasn't been farmed in 50 years really doesn't make sense. Again, the 3-to-1 journeyman to ratio apprentice ratio is an issue on the commercial side as well. And the last one is, I know the committee from time to time has ordered PURA to open dockets. This one would be to incentivize the utilities to allow more distributed generation projects to connect to to the grid. The speed at which this happens is very slow. And it creates time, and in development world and business world, time is money. So we'd really love to see an investigation, I shouldn't say investigation, just an examination of how this process works and how it can be made better. That's all I have for you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mike. Lot there to unpack. What do you recommend? What do you recommend that the ratio of journeyman to apprentice should be 2:2?
1-to-1 would be the best. I mean, it's 1-to-1 in some states. There are no ratios in other states. I know there's a bill that's 3-to-2 for a 2-year period. So it will be a sort of a trial base to see how it works. I mean, I think if you went that route, kick the tires for a couple of years to see how many apprentices you could put to work. I think that would be a helpful process. It would meet with the appreciation of our members and their satisfaction, I'm sure.
Okay, you do know there's been a lot of resistance to eliminating caps completely and doubling them last year, and providing incentives for distressed communities, I thought was a huge step forward.
It was.
So, you know, I think that we're going to have a conversation around that, not only amongst ourselves, but with the agency itself. So,
if I could just say, I've been listening to the speakers all day, and it is, especially now with the price of electricity, it seems like in a lot of ways we're talking about doing the same thing all over again. And if there are multiple opportunities to do solar in the state of Connecticut, good solar puts people to work, reduces prices, and I clearly understand. The cap was doubled last year already. This is not the right year to ask for lifting the caps again. I just wanted to bring you how members feel, and I think it is somewhat alarming that we've reached the capacity on the small NRES in just a couple of days.
I understand that. And, I'm a big believer that the future is grid scale procurements and distributed generation. That's where we have to go. How do you manage that? How you manage all those inputs into the system is complicated when they're intermittent, but I think the future is going to be a combination of that. It's just doing it in the most prudent way. Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mike, thank you for testifying, and thank you particularly for being so specific in terms of your recommendations. Let's start with something simple. What's the penetration of solar in the state of Connecticut?
About 3.25%.
And how does that compare to, say, like Massachusetts or New York?
On an apples to apple, on a per capita basis, I think we're far behind Massachusetts, maybe a third.
That's my understanding as well. And I think the point you just made in response to Chair Needleman is apt. Given the conversation we've had, even though we made a major stride forward in raising caps last year, circumstances may be viewed through a different lens now that we recognize we have an extended supply issue in New England and in Connecticut, which may last a decade or more, and therefore the old paradigm, which we seem to be transitioning out of, needs to be looked at with fresh eyes. I personally feel like we've lost a little momentum in terms of the adoption of solar in the state, and that leads me to believe that perhaps on a limited basis, particularly like the NRES program, because it was so quickly subscribed, maybe we ought to take a second look at another little lift to enable the marketplace to take advantage of opportunity. So I'm open to that. You also mentioned the challenges involved with utilities permitting projects quickly enough, and also the issues with taxing by municipalities. Would you be in favor of the state being involved with creating some uniformity in process? I happen to like the idea you have for piloting the idea of an app that would streamline a little bit for municipalities to permit projects, but do we need a top-down solution to move things along across the board here?
The programs, the NRES and the RRES tariff programs are a year old. So it might be a little unfair to cast criticism on them at this point. But, in the absence of increasing caps, I think there's plenty of work that can be done to make the current programs better. Can make interconnection better. I mean, and we've on regular discussions with the utilities through the interconnection working group. We talk with them on a regular basis. They have staffing issues there that I think are slowing the process down. I mean, we've been told more than once that they don't have the staff necessary in place to churn through these applications as quickly as we like. Now, granted, some of these applications get dumped on them in huge numbers, and then there's a slow period. Weather has something to do with that. I mean, so it's I don't want to point the finger at the utilities too negatively at that point. I mean, the distribution teams over there are really good, but we're at the point now. I think we need to make some changes in these current programs just to make them better if we're not going to make them bigger.
Thank you. I look forward to any specifics you can offer us. As you know, we will have a solar bill this year, which may be far ranging, at least in terms of its purposes for provoking conversation in a public hearing. So we're eager to hear all sorts of solutions that particularly would address our supply issues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Next up is Renew New England. We have a new name, Renew England.
Apparently,
They could use it there.
that
too.
was off the record. You weren't supposed to put that in public.
Oh, the name change happened a number of years ago. Apparently hasn't caught up here. Let's see. Right, good afternoon. Francis Polaro, Renew Northeast, and it's a pleasure to be here to discuss the benefits of clean energy with you this afternoon. And these are my members up here. There's about 50 of them now. I think back to the first time I was here in 2011, I think we had 7. So I think our growth is a testament to the policies of this state and the other states of New England and federal policies trying to advance clean energy. And without those, they wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be here. And our job is to help the states realize their clean energy policies. My membership is made up not just of developers of offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, but we've added in recent years large energy storage developers, transmission developers, and I also have an esteemed group of environmental advocates who are on my board as well. The other thing that's changed radically since I was first here is that the amount of renewable energy development in the ISO New England queue has changed dramatically. In fact, I stole this graphic from the ISO CEO from his slides to you last week. But even if you go back longer than 2017, there was very little in the way of renewable energy development in the queue. And now it dominates. It's almost exclusively renewable energy. And they're pretty much all Renew members. So I think that's to the conversation earlier about investment and signals and what investors are betting on. They're betting on clean energy. They're not betting on natural gas. And I think it was Dan who had a slide too, that there's a lot of transmission in the interconnection queue. And I'll get to that in a moment. But without transmission, none of this happens. And we're already at the limit where we're exceedingly challenged to get these large projects to the grid. And again, I could go back to 2011 to my first testimony as with Renew. And we were talking then about the great potential for land-based wind in Maine and how we couldn't unlock it because of transmission. And it's only the last few months where Maine and Massachusetts were able to get together on transmission, 10, 15 years later that it's finally starting to happen. I think Senator Needleman, you alluded to this just a moment ago when you said that the climate between the states is changing, where they realize that they do have to work together to make this possible, because frankly the biggest obstacle to implementing state policies for clean energy have been the states themselves. We've seen in other regions like Texas and California and some of the Midwest states where they have been able to get together to build the transmission that's necessary. And in those regions, renewable energy development has flourished. I mean, we're seeing in Texas at some peak times where 70% of the energy being provided to the grid is by wind power. So when you look at New England, we have, such a small percentage, low single digits of renewable penetration here. There's a lot of talk about reliability, but it's all about fossil fuel reliability. It's not about renewables, because frankly, there isn't that much here. I know there's everybody has slides like this on the volatility of natural gas and why it causes spikes. So I'm gonna skip through that, and I'm gonna get to the slide that Dan Dolan also had about Canadian hydro performance. And it's not to knock what happened with Quebec and them not only not supplying hydropower to us when we need it. I too, first time I can remember ever seeing the power reverse like that. But I think it's Senator Needleman, you mentioned this earlier, like what about two-way flows? And I think that's exactly what everybody's thinking about. Just a couple of years ago, ISO New England completed a study for Utility National Grid about hydropower, and the ISO found that two-way power flows between Eastern Canada and New England made a whole lot of sense. There's a very long MIT paper on this with a nice 2-page summary as well on two-way trade with hydro. So again, it's not to knock it, but I think, again, going back to some testimony I wrote 10, 12 years ago, I know I used the words like, why isn't, when we talk about transmission to Canada, why isn't it a two-way street? And I think, we've been talking about hydro to Canada for so long. We have an opportunity to get it right. And frankly, if you look at what happened last weekend, when temperatures dipped, even land-based renewables like solar performed very well and predictably. When the sun came up, the solar picked up, and when the sunset came, the solar went down, and the land-based wind resources were performing consistently across that period. As more renewables come on in New England, and especially offshore wind, we have a real opportunity to export as well and use Eastern Canada as a giant battery. And that's what these papers are talking about. And it's, you're going to have instances like this where Quebec's going to draw on New England like a battery, but we'll have a lot of offshore wind, and it tends to do, this is probably what it looked like out south of Martha's Vineyard on Friday when the cold air was coming in and the winds were kicking up. But as we've seen with some analysis I'm going to talk about in a moment, offshore wind particularly is good when it's cold and when it's winter. So, but even the land-based resources, even solar, it's not the best performer here in the northeast during the winter. But a lot of these cold spells, it doesn't snow. It's just really clear and really cold, but the sun is still shining. So you can see here that during the daylight hours, we got a lot of sun to generate solar power. And that just means that much less oil that had to be burned at that moment that was being offset by solar. And the same goes true for the wind resources, particularly that we have some large power plants that have been running for over 10 years now reliably in northern New England. And as I said, we distilled a comprehensive economic study that ISO New England did for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center a few years ago after the 2018 cold event. And they looked at a hypothetical 800 and 1200 megawatt offshore wind project had it been on the grid there, just to show the millions of dollars of savings and avoided emissions that day. So with 1,600 megawatts, they were looking at about $80 million in savings. So about double what the penalty was for those fossil fuel generators that didn't perform on Christmas Eve. We also did a look back. So you just don't, the ISO looked at one snapshot of one cold day, but we used Daymark Energy Advisors to do some analysis. And we have all of their analysis on our website. But just to go back in time, if that same wind plant had been running going way back at those same prices, you consistently see those winter savings, each month. So there's real value as you think about bills. This isn't just about carbon emissions, but it is adds to the diversity of our supply. That's not fuel constrained. The fuel is free, and it helps keep downward pressure on prices. So I'm not going to go through too much, but we did just do some projections going forward on some of the savings. And again, there are health issues to consider here as well. Connecticut has a fleet of dirty peakers that turn on in the summer and the winter just to get us through. They have their slow startup times. They're generating emissions even though they're not even generating electricity yet. So we did some analysis on what the health consequences are when you're emitting not just carbon, but traditional pollutants. They still do exist. And when you're burning coal and oil in New England, they tend to be very harmful and very costly to our health. So the last section I'm going to conclude with is what's needed. And I'm not going to ask for any new legislation because you've already passed a lot. We just need to execute on it. There's been a lot of procurement legislation that's been passed going back to 2013, Public Act 13-303. And, the Commissioner Dykes has in her integrated resources plan really cataloged all the different laws that are out there and what's been procured. And you can see that there are a lot of laws on the books that are being underused. And the fact is that large projects in particular, take a long time to build, and not including when you factor in the length of time to get the transmission built ahead of it. So we're really way behind. And if you think about you're running a procurement next week for offshore wind, it's for a project that's not even going to be online until the end of the decade at best. So a procurement today doesn't have any rate impact for the next number of years, good or bad, just because it's going to take that long. So we really need to get moving on the authority that you've given. It's not, somebody said, I forget who it was, that we have a mandate through these laws. Well, you do in Massachusetts, but here in Connecticut, the department has total discretion on the when and the how we do these procurements. And the first one I was going to discuss was in 2021. So now 2 years ago, the legislature required 1,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030 with an interim target by 2024. Well, 2 years later, there's still no procurement on the horizon. And I can tell you that you're not going to get a large storage project interconnected, having all the studies done with ISO New England, having all the permitting done and online in a year. It's just not going to happen. So we're way behind. And here it would encourage the department to move with deliberate speed and to issue a procurement as soon as possible this year. The next two slides cover what we have been procuring on the renewable energy front and what remains. You can see here that it's a little bit tough here because the labels are in megawatts, and this isn't the authority that was given to the department wasn't just for renewable energy, which, as everyone knows, doesn't have 100% capacity factor, but nuclear was also included in the procurement. So this isn't megawatts. So it looks like, wow, offshore wind has just dominates, but when you actually convert it to megawatt hours, it's really nuclear that we were talking about. And so we certainly supported what the legislature did. For my members who own 2 nuclear assets in New England, we really need to protect them and make sure that they're there to see us to 2030 or maybe even beyond, again, because that's where we are with the pipeline now. So that was really important. But I also don't want to suggest that we've done enough, because we haven't. Because while we've protected what we had to do for the existing, we need to move forward with the new. And this is lifted from the integrated resources plan. You can see that a tremendous amount of procurement authority going back to 2013, the first one, section 6, and all the way through. There's if you were to extract the nuclear for Seabrook and Millstone from that, there's very little in the way of except for a couple of the major offshore wind projects. We're really lagging behind our own goals and the rest of the region. In fact, some of these projects have since, even though it's showing up as being procured, they've in fact had to drop out a long time ago because there was insufficient transmission, especially for some of the main projects, to be able to interconnect to the grid. So it's a real challenge, and the transmission challenge is one that we've really struggled with the last 10, 15 years to get renewables built, with the 6 New England states having submitted proposals just over the last couple of weeks to the Department of Energy. We're encouraged by that the times are changing. I think the only thing that's really changed is that there's federal dollars available to pay for it, and so the states are rallying together. My suspicion is if it weren't for that, the states would still be sort of wrestling with their different political interests, just like TCI and everything else. And it's made it very hard to get these big projects together. But the authority is there. We need the states to act together. We need the states to implement the clean energy procurement laws that their legislatures have given them, and it can work. The last thing, and I've been talking about transmission for a long time, but I just wanted to summarize and conclude my remarks that transmission is really a regional issue. It has been our obstacle. And there are also some issues with how ISO New England operates or will allow new transmission to come to the grid that could be very limiting. The size of the transmission line would be limited to 1,200 megawatts, while transmission for our nuclear resources and our Canadian hydro imports routinely are allowed to operate above that. When you look at the cost of transmission that was put up on the screen by numerous parties before, and you ask like why is it so expensive? Well, there are ways to keep costs down. And so I would encourage the legislature to ask the ISO, what are ways that you can work on to ensure that when the states do go out to procure transmission, they can get it at the least cost possible. So those are all my remarks, and I thank you for your time this afternoon.
All I can say is thank you, Francis. Every time I hear you and listen to you, I get a different take and a really comprehensive view of the problem that we're all looking to solve. I do know that we've gone a long way in the last several years with procurement authority. And if I'm not mistaken, half of the battery is pure, half is deep.
That's right.
And I think one side may be a little further along than the other one.
The Pura side is definitely further along. There's a smaller smaller storage program, which Pura has lifted off. They do have one for slightly larger storage that Pura is looking to kick off this year, and they've designed some really complex rules to try to get at reliability solutions that can be satisfied perhaps more cost effectively using storage. So Pura, it did take a couple years, but they did start working on it right away. So I do congratulate Chair Gillette for that.
Thank you. None of this happens quickly, as you know, and the markets drive a lot. Like we were hearing from our friends at Avangrid that the cost of the procurement that they were awarded is now much higher, and there's a discussion going on. It's just complicated. I have been speaking to somebody up in Montreal who's very involved in trying to model this whole regional transmission thing. And he's the one who suggested that I read that book called Superpower, which I thought was a fascinating book about trying to build, multi-state transmission lines and all the hurdles that you come up with. So I'm gonna, and we are down to the last half hour here. We're half hour over, but always appreciate listening to you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I will echo those comments and only offer up one question. I was talking to Commissioner Dykes recently, and she noted that mostly thanks to the pandemic, a number of grid scale solar projects kind of fell by the wayside. Are they going to come back? What's your prognostication on us gearing back up to grid scale solar, given prices coming down and the great need?
Yeah, I think there are several challenges facing projects throughout the region. Certainly one is inflation. We're seeing that's not just in building new energy infrastructure. I know in my town, we thought we were going to build a school for X dollars and, went out to referendum for that amount. And lo and behold, it came in $10 million higher. And so we're shrinking the size of the building and trying to do everything just to keep the project going. But when you're developing a renewable energy project, you can't really kind of cheat like that. So certainly inflation has been a challenge. I think there's some other complexities that continue to make it challenging for projects. Interconnection is a huge one. The amount of, it's not just the solar, but we're even seeing challenges for large battery projects, 5 to 7 years to get through an interconnection queue, perhaps. We're also seeing some unexpected costs from the utilities. When developers are looking to sign their interconnection agreement, they're then told that the utilities require them to pay ongoing maintenance cost for transmission, potentially for the life of the project. And it's been some surprise billing, if I can borrow a term from the medical world. And I think it's really also putting a lot of pressure on projects. And we've actually filed a complaint with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission about it, because it's a substantial burden. And when we talk about transparency, it's not a charge that is imposed in any other region of the country, and one we'd like to see eliminated here. So there's a lot of factors. Siting is one. I know Mike Trahan was talking a lot about that, so I won't go into it. But projects are going through. You are going to lose. You've lost some over the COVID period for sure. But I think that the projects can certainly come back as the economy and prices stabilize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Any other question? Again, thank you so
Thank you.
much, friends. Next up are our friends from Dominion Energy.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Hi, Weezy.
Hi, Senator.
How are you?
Very good. Thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation to provide an overview of Millstone Nuclear Power Station. This is a great aerial view of the station. We're located in Waterford, Connecticut, nestled right in between the town of East Lyme and the city of New London in the southeast corner of the state. So if you flip to the next slide, we always start with safety. Safety comes first at Millstone Nuclear Power Station. It's the first of 5 core values at Dominion Energy. It's at the forefront of everything we do at Millstone, all the way down to the use of handrails when you're going up and down the stairs, or not texting while walking. Both of those are against company policy. The station itself was designed and built and is operated and guarded with multiple redundant layers of safety and security. As an industry, we're always striving for excellence, not just meeting the rules and regulations, but excellence in safety and operations. We actually, just last month, OSHA renewed Millstone's Star Worksite status. So that's the highest level of distinction that OSHA gives out through its voluntary protection program, and it recognizes employers who have implemented excellent safety and health management systems at their work sites. So I'll just jump right into Millstone Power Station, slide 3. We view Millstone really as the carbon-free foundation for a clean, affordable, and reliable electric grid here in New England. Millstone itself is a 2,100 megawatt nuclear power station that produces 16 to 17 million megawatt hours of carbon-free electricity each year. That's more than any other resource in all of New England. Just to put that, I'm sorry, go back to, there you go. Just to put that number into perspective, the 16 to 17 million megawatt hours, Connecticut consumes roughly 28 million megawatt hours of electricity each year. So we have the capability to power just over half of Connecticut's electricity needs on an annual basis. Millstone accounts for more than 90% of the carbon-free power that's produced here in the state of Connecticut, and not surprisingly, its continued operation would prevent 4 million tons of CO2 from being released into the atmosphere each year. On the right-hand side of the slide, sorry, Will. I shouldn't, I'm Italian, I speak with my hands, so on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see a bit more detail on each of the 2 units. So unit 2 is the smaller of the 2 units at 900 megawatts, and unit 3 is a 1230 megawatt unit. They are licensed to operate through 2035 and 2045 respectively. And as some of you may know, unit 1 ceased operations in the 90s. That was before Dominion's ownership of the station, which began in 2001. Now I'm ready, Will, to go to slide 4. So this is one of my favorite slides. You've seen a snapshot of this all day. This data comes from ISO New England, and actually this is a slightly different look. It's the evolution of the resource mix over time. So where our electricity has come from over the years. And as you can see that over the last 2 decades, coal and oil-fired generation has been displaced by primarily natural gas-fired generation. Now natural gas is the predominant fuel source, producing close to half of the electricity here in the region. Nuclear power is the next largest source of electricity here in New England, and as a highly reliable, carbon-free baseload resource, we believe it's absolutely critical here in the region as part of the resource mix. There are only 2 remaining nuclear power stations here in New England: Millstone here in Connecticut, and Seabrook, which is up in Seabrook, New Hampshire. Seabrook is a single unit, roughly 1,200 megawatt nuclear power station. It's pretty astounding. The 2 stations, Millstone and Seabrook, supply a quarter of the region's electricity needs each year. They are without a doubt the workhorses of the region, in my view. Roughly 16% of our energy needs are met by imports of power over transmission lines from neighboring power systems. Most of this is coming down from Hydro-Quebec over a very long transmission line all the way down from James Bay and dumping into Ayer, Massachusetts, where the power is converted from DC to AC and put onto the New England power system. Renewables make up about 10% of the energy mix, hydro about 6%. And coal and oil together make up less than 1%, which means that they run fairly infrequently, typically when it's just very, very hot out or very, very cold out in the wintertime. Moving to slide 5. You all are, of course, familiar with the 2 power purchase agreements we have with Eversource and United Illuminating. We entered into those agreements after a competitive procurement process that DEEP administered back in 2018 to help procure zero carbon resources to meet the state's carbon reduction goals. Under those agreements, Eversource and United Illuminating are purchasing 9 million megawatt hours of Millstone's energy each year, along with 100% of our environmental attributes for a fixed price of $49.99 a megawatt hour, or 4.9 cents a kilowatt hour. That continues to be one of the lowest cost carbon-free resources that Connecticut has procured to date. After the utilities purchase the energy from Millstone at $49.99 a megawatt hour, they turn around and sell it into the wholesale electricity market. And recently they've been able to sell it for quite a bit more than $49.99 a megawatt hour and earned significant revenues on Millstone's energy. So last year in 2022, the utilities earned more than $250 million on those power purchase agreements, and all those revenues are being returned to ratepayers under the terms of the agreements. In fact, accelerating the return of some of those revenues on January 1 was a big part of Governor Lamont's customer relief plan that he announced at the end of last year. So we're pleased to see the power purchase agreements performing well for the state. They have provided a capital intensive resource like Millstone, the revenue stability and predictability to continue operating. And at the same time, they've provided the state a beneficial financial hedge, particularly recently in the face of high wholesale electricity prices. One last thing I'll mention, under the terms of the agreements, Dominion Energy also has an obligation to pursue all new revenue opportunities available to existing nuclear power stations. And any of the revenues that we earn would be likewise returned to ratepayers under the terms of the agreements. And since those contracts were executed, it's great to see the tremendous support from the federal government for existing nuclear power stations and preserving those facilities. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included a $6 billion civil nuclear credit program to help preserve existing nuclear power stations across the country. And we're preparing our application right now so that we're ready to submit it to the Department of Energy as soon as that application window opens. In addition, the Inflation Reduction Act includes a production tax credit for existing nuclear power stations, which will begin next January. And we will also be pursuing those revenues. The revenues we earn through these programs could really help eliminate the downside risk of the power purchase agreements and the exposure to ratepayers if wholesale electricity prices are low, but they preserve the upside benefit of the contracts and Connecticut's ability to turn a profit on those contracts when wholesale power prices are high. Flipping to slide 6, very quickly, we were also pleased to see the results of DEEP's latest integrated resources plan. It included a scenario analysis that looked at 4 different pathways to reach the state's goal of 100% zero carbon electricity supplies by 2040. That's now a statutory mandate. The scenario that modeled Millstone's continued operation through 2040 under the same contractual arrangement with the state's 2 utilities proved to be the least cost pathway to reaching that goal, saving ratepayers roughly $5 billion compared to some of the other zero carbon scenarios. And then slide 7, one last slide before I wrap up. Dominion Energy, like some of the other developers in the room, we're a big supporter of offshore wind. We're in the process of developing a 2,600 megawatt offshore wind farm off the coast of Virginia Beach. We're also leading a consortium of industry participants in the construction of the first Jones Act compliant offshore wind turbine installation vessel. The Jones Act, as you all know, requires that any goods and merchandise like turbine blades or tower components be transported on ships that are U.S. built, U.S. owned, U.S. flagged, and U.S. operated. And today, the only vessels capable of doing that are foreign-owned vessels. So we knew this investment would be necessary to support not only our project, but many other offshore wind projects up and down the East Coast for decades to come. So that ship is being built in Texas right now. It's expected to be sea ready by end of 2023. So this year, and actually first deployed out of New London to support the installation of offshore wind projects being developed by Ørsted and Eversource. So I will turn to slide 8. This is my last slide here to wrap up. We're very proud of Millstone, proud of the 1,000 employees there, hardworking men and women. I think Dan Dolan showed a figure that there are 4,000 power plant workers across the region. I'm proud to be a quarter of those. And we're proud of the grid reliability, fuel diversity, energy security, price stability, emissions benefits that we add to the power system. And we want to secure Millstone's long-term future for decades to come, so we can help not only Connecticut, but the entire New England region meet its decarbonization goals in the most affordable and reliable way possible. So that's where I will close it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Izzy. And I think we all appreciate having Millstone in the region and in Connecticut with its job benefits and all of its other incumbent energy benefits. I do want to shout out Congressman Courtney and his efforts in Washington to reopen the discussion around what to do with spent fuel, because that has had a major impact on the propagation of new nuclear energy. So I know that they're actively working and soliciting locations to move spent fuel, and that alone would open up space at Millstone for modular reactors that we talked about at my last visit, disassembling reactor 1, which is still there basically, and freeing up the space. And I could see a time when we would be looking to add capacity out there. And that's why we passed the bill that we did pass 2 years ago. And going to have some minor technical fixes, I've been told, but I'm glad to be part of that. I'm glad we're part of that. And Millstone could be a test case for how we begin to move forward and with more nuclear capacity, because it's 10 years minimal to do anything, but at least it's something that we think we can achieve. And the first 50 megawatt nuclear modular reactors were approved recently. And it just has always seemed odd that we probably have a dozen of them at any point in the Groton, New London area, sitting in cigars in the water. So, yeah. And the federal government seems to manage to get rid of their spent nuclear fuel without any issues. So, so it's exciting. It's a beautiful operation out there, and I hope we can keep it around for a while.
Thank you, Senator.
Representative Foster.
It's a very small room though. I started reading this morning. We just got the nuclear task force report today. So I started reading, I'm like 11 pages in out of 169. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting on it was that under the section on station economic viability, it looks like you're not going to be eligible for all the IRA tax credits. Is there something you can tell us about that? And is there something that we could be doing that would offer help in making sure that that money was accessible to folks in state?
So it's a great question. And the reason some folks don't believe will be eligible is because wholesale power prices might be much higher than the program and its threshold as it phases out the credit. So the production tax credit for existing nuclear, I believe it starts at $15 a megawatt hour, and then it ratchets down for every dollar above $25 a megawatt hour in gross receipts for the plant. So over time, it will ratchet down. And so if power prices, and they have been quite high, if they are high and our revenues are above a $40 to $44 megawatt hour range, then we wouldn't be eligible. But if power prices are very low and our revenues actually come in quite low, then we would be eligible for those credits. It just really depends on gross receipts for the plant. And that's still being defined by the U.S. Treasury. They'll be releasing draft regulations relatively soon here. We'll be participating in that process to give Connecticut and Millstone every opportunity to go after those credits. It's really about defining gross receipts and making sure that Millstone will be able to compete for those credits.
Thanks. That's my only question.
Thank you, Representative Piscopo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative.
I remember maybe your informational in this committee, might have been Environment Committee last term, that you were going over some really you had a great presentation, real promising technologies on hydrogen development. Is that in the works, or have we made progress on that since we've heard from you? Or
So we were part of the hydrogen task force, and we actually had the hydrogen task force out at Millstone. We've always said Millstone, being the most abundant supply of carbon-free energy in all of New England, could be leveraged to produce clean hydrogen. And so we're exploring those opportunities actively. And I think we'll see once the regional hydrogen hubs are announced. We're part of the Northeast Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, Dominion Energy is, and I think once those hubs are revealed and decided on, I think we'll have more information there.
And just briefly, in your earlier presentation from New England, NEPOG, New England Producers of Energy or
Power Generators
Power
Association.
Generation, they mentioned that there's smaller units that are in the works,
That's
but
right.
they don't seem to be able to take off. Have you know of any going around the country or?
There are demonstration projects going on right now across the country, so I'm a little more enthusiastic than Dan, but I understand his comments for sure. So the first SMR design was just approved by the NRC. That was NuScale's 77 megawatt small modular reactor, and I believe I just saw last week an announcement about the first commercial grid scale SMR. I believe up in Ontario, so this will be the first in North America with Ontario Power, and I believe it's the GE Hitachi SMR that they're going with, which is a 300 megawatt small modular reactor. I believe I read in the article that would be commercial in late 2028. I think that's great if that comes to be. We will see. Everything always takes a little longer, but I'm very enthusiastic about advanced nuclear technologies, the support at the federal level for advanced nuclear technologies, including small modular reactors. Dominion Energy is very supportive. We're investing in the GE Hitachi research and development surrounding that particular design. And so I believe it'll be a part of our decarbonization journey in the decades to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Anybody online looking to talk? No, thank you. Well, just never know. Weezy, thank you so much again. And for any members of this committee that haven't been out to Millstone, I suggest that when there's an opportunity, you go. It's well worth the visit. I warmed my toes in the reactor, and I don't have any. It explains a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes,
Thank
it does. Geez, I'm surrounded by comedians here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Thank you, Izzy. Next informational forum is February 16th at 12, room 2C via Zoom and live. And we do have a public hearing coming up next, eventually. I think it's next Tuesday.
I might add the report from Pure that we had hoped to have on Thursday has been postponed, obviously because of session, and will be rescheduled.
Thank you. With that, meeting is adjourned.